At family dinner, my sister introduced her new boyfriend, and for some reason they all kept staring at me like I was a diseased stray. When he finally asked what I do for work, my own mother cut me off saying, "Do not embarrass us tonight." Everyone laughed and my sister added that I should probably just lie this time so I do not sound so utterly pathetic. I just smiled, took a slow sip of my ice water, and thought about the termination papers sitting in my briefcase. The papers that would not only destroy his entire career by morning, but would legally hand me the keys to my parents' entire livelihood. My name is Nora. I am 34 years old, and I spent my entire life being the family punching bag while secretly building an empire they could not even fathom. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit quietly while toxic family members dug their own financial graves. The air inside Alinea, one of Chicago's most exclusive Michelin star restaurants, smelled of black truffle and old money. The ambient lighting caught the edge of the crystal wine glasses, casting sharp shadows across the crisp white tablecloth. I sat at the far end of the private dining table, wearing a simple tailored charcoal suit that my family assumed came off a clearance rack. In reality, it was bespoke, just like the massive corporate life I had built entirely out of their sight. To my left sat my mother Diane, wearing her signature pearl necklace and an expression of perpetual disappointment whenever she looked in my direction. Next to her was my father Richard, who spent the first 10 minutes of the dinner complaining loudly about the valet service. Across from me was my brother Brandon and his wife Jasmine. Jasmine caught my eye and gave me a warm, knowing smile. She is a brilliant African-American woman who runs circles around my brother intellectually, yet she is constantly subjected to my parents' passive-aggressive remarks. We shared a silent bond of survival in this deeply flawed family. But the true stars of the evening were my younger sister Savannah and her new boyfriend Preston. Savannah was 30 years old and still acted like a teenager who had just won a popularity contest. She clung to Preston's arm as if he were a trophy she had won at a high-end auction. Preston was exactly the kind of man my parents worshipped. He was 36, loud, wore far too much cologne, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who thought belittling waitstaff was a charming personality trait. We were supposed to be celebrating their 6-month anniversary, an event my mother deemed important enough to demand my attendance mostly so Savannah would have someone to look down upon to boost her own fragile ego. Preston finished a bite of Wagyu beef, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and finally looked down the table at me. He tilted his head, his eyes scanning my modest appearance with blatant amusement. "So Nora, Savannah tells me you are still doing the freelance typing thing," he said loudly. "What exactly do you do for work these days? Are you doing data entry for temp agencies?" Before I could even open my mouth to answer, my mother slammed her wine glass down on the table. The sharp clink of crystal echoed loudly in the private room. "Please, Preston, do not ask her that," my mother snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "Do not embarrass us tonight, Nora. We are here to celebrate your sister and Preston. We do not need to hear about your struggles to make rent this month." A chorus of mean-spirited laughter erupted around the table. My father chuckled, shaking his head. Brandon looked down at his plate, too cowardly to defend me, though Jasmine tightened her jaw in obvious anger. Savannah leaned forward, a malicious smirk playing on her glossed lips. "Seriously, Nora, maybe just lie this time so you do not sound so pathetic in front of Preston. Tell him you walk dogs for rich people or something. At least that sounds like steady income." I did not flinch. I did not argue. I just smiled, a small, cold smile that none of them knew how to interpret, and took a slow sip of my sparkling water. Seeing that I was not going to give them the reaction they wanted, Preston scoffed. He clearly thrived on being the center of attention, and my absolute silence gave him the perfect opening to take the floor once again. "Well, someone has to do the grunt work," he said smoothly, shooting Savannah a wink. He then aggressively pulled back his sleeve, deliberately flashing a heavy platinum Rolex that caught the chandelier light. "But let us talk about the future. I just got promoted to Senior Vice President at Nova Data Solutions." My parents physically leaned in, their eyes wide with absolute reverence. My mother clasped her hands together as if praying to a new deity. That is absolutely incredible, Preston. My father beamed. VP at 36, you are going to run that company someday. Preston chuckled, a deeply arrogant sound that vibrated in his chest. Run it, Richard. I am going to bleed it for all it is worth. We just got acquired by some massive, secretive private equity firm out of New York. The stock options alone are going to make me a multi-millionaire by Friday. They are throwing money around like it is nothing, and I am right at the top of the food chain holding a very large bucket. Savannah squealed, kissing his cheek loudly. My future husband, everyone. The tech genius. They hung on his every word. My parents asked him probing questions about his corner office, his new bonus structure, and his golf handicap. They actively ignored me, treating me like a ghost haunting their perfect family dinner. They had no idea that the massive, secretive private equity firm he was bragging about was called Aegis Capital, and they certainly had no idea that I was its founder and CEO. Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling the expensive Cabernet in his glass. He was practically vibrating with self-importance. The acquisition is going to be finalized by Friday, he declared, making sure his voice carried to the waiters hovering nearby. And when the ink dries, my stock options vest immediately. We are talking high 7 figures. They are gutting the old executive board, but they already assured me my position is safe. In fact, they need my vision to steer the transition. I will basically be running the entire division. Savannah gazed at him with wide, adoring eyes. She reached out and traced the lapel of his suit jacket. You are going to be a millionaire before you even turn 40, babe. We are going to need a bigger house, maybe something in the Gold Coast. My father nodded vigorously, already calculating how he could leverage Preston's newfound wealth to save his own sinking logistics company. That is how you do it, Preston. Real business. Hard work and strategy. Not like some people who waste their potential on dead-end gigs. He cast a pointed glare in my direction. I kept my face perfectly neutral. It was almost comical listening to Preston brag about his job security. I had personally reviewed the executive restructuring plan for Nova Data Solutions at 6 o'clock that morning. Preston was not being promoted. He was being investigated. But I let him have his moment. Preston noticed my silence and mistook it for jealousy. He let out a condescending sigh and reached into the inside pocket of his suit. He pulled out a sleek leather money clip that looked like it had cost more than my first car. He peeled off a crisp $20 bill and placed it on the white tablecloth. With a theatrical flick of his fingers, he slid the money across the table until it stopped right next to my water glass. Go ahead and take it, Nora, he said, flashing a blindingly white, perfectly veneered smile. Buy yourself a better outfit for those little freelance typing gigs of yours. You have to dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Though I suppose if you are just sitting in your living room all day, it does not really matter. Still treat yourself to something nice. Savannah giggled and leaned over to kiss his cheek. Oh my God, Preston, you are so bad. But seriously, you are so charitable. Do not spend it all in one place, Nora. My mother let out a delicate, approving laugh. That is very generous of you, Preston. Nora, say thank you to your future brother-in-law. I looked at the $20 bill. Then I looked at Preston. I did not reach for the money. I did not speak. The silence stretched uncomfortable for everyone but me. Before my mother could scold me for being ungrateful, a hand reached across the table. Jasmine, my sister-in-law, grabbed the $20 bill. Her dark eyes flashed with an anger I rarely saw her display in public. She flicked her wrist, sending the bill sliding right back across the table. It bumped against Preston's wine glass. Nora works hard, Preston, Jasmine said, her voice steady and dangerously calm. Keep your money. You might need it more than she does. The temperature in the room plummeted. Preston's arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a dark, offended scowl. Savannah gasped, clutching her napkin to her chest, as if she had just witnessed a physical assault. My father slammed his heavy hand down on the table, making the silverware rattle. Watch your tone, Jasmine, he growled, his face flushing red with sudden fury. You are relatively new to this family. You do not get to disrespect our guests, especially a man who is going out of his way to help your sister-in-law. Jasmine did not back down. She sat up straighter, adjusting the cuffs of her blouse. Insulting someone is not helping them, Richard. It is bullying. And I will not sit here and watch you all gang up on Nora, just because she does not fit into your corporate country club fantasy. Brandon, Jasmine's husband, and my spineless brother visibly shrank in his seat. He looked frantically between his raging father and his defiant wife. He swallowed hard and put a trembling hand on Jasmine's arm. "Come on, Jazz," Brandon muttered, keeping his voice low. "Do not make a scene. Just apologize to Preston so we can finish dinner. He was just making a joke." Jasmine slowly turned her head to look at her husband. The sheer disappointment in her eyes was enough to make him pull his hand away. "I will not apologize for defending a woman who is constantly treated like garbage by her own blood," she said clearly. My mother aggressively cleared her throat, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You do not understand how this family works, Jasmine," she said, her tone dripping with elitist condescension. "Nora has been a burden since she decided to reject every opportunity we tried to hand her. We are simply pushing her to be better. If you cannot handle our family dynamics, perhaps you should step outside." I watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and cold calculation. Jasmine was the only one in this room with a moral compass, and they were trying to crush her for it. I gently placed my hand over Jasmine's under the table, giving her a reassuring squeeze. She looked at me, her chest heaving slightly, but she stayed firmly in her seat. Preston sneered, picking up his $20 bill and stuffing it back into his pocket. "Whatever. Some people just want to stay at the bottom. I was only trying to toss her a bone. But let us get back to things that actually matter. Waiter, we are ready for the check, and put it on my card. I want to treat my new family." He waved his hand pompously as the waiter approached. But this was Alinea. They did not just hand over a check. The waiter presented a small, elegant black leather folder, placing it gently on the table. Savannah snatched it up immediately, eager to see the damage. She opened the folder and her eyes widened slightly at the number. $4,200. She looked at the total, then slowly turned her gaze toward me. A cruel, calculated idea sparked in her eyes. She closed the folder and tossed it across the table. It landed squarely on my empty plate. "Actually," Savannah said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "since you contribute absolutely nothing to the family business and you clearly have so much pride, the least you can do is buy us dinner to celebrate Preston's promotion. Pay the bill, Nora." I looked down at the black leather folder resting on my plate. $4,200. For a normal person, and certainly for the struggling freelance typist my family believed me to be, this was a devastating amount of money. It was months of rent. It was a crisis. My mother leaned back in her chair, a look of utter satisfaction settling over her features. "Yes, Nora," she agreed. "Preston was generous enough to offer you a handout. The least you can do is show some gratitude and cover the celebratory dinner. It is time you started contributing to this family instead of just taking up space." Preston crossed his arms, his expensive suit straining slightly against his shoulders. "I do not want to bankrupt her, Diane," he said with a mock sympathetic sigh. "If she needs to wash dishes in the back to pay it off, I am sure the kitchen staff could use the help." Laughter erupted again. Savannah clapped her hands together, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. "Come on, Nora. Open your purse. Let us see that debit card." Jasmine reached into her own handbag, her face tight with absolute fury. "I am not letting you do this to her," she said fiercely. "I will pay half, Nora. We can split it." I gently placed my hand over the black folder, stopping Jasmine from opening her wallet. "No, Jasmine," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. "Put your money away. I have got this." My father snorted. "With what? Monopoly money. You do not even have a corporate job, let alone the kind of credit limit required for a place like Alinea. Do not make a fool of yourself. Just admit you are broke and apologize to your sister for ruining her night." I ignored him. Instead, I simply raised my right hand and caught the eye of the restaurant general manager, who had been hovering near the entrance of our private room. He was a distinguished man in his late 50s, dressed in a flawless tuxedo. He had been briefed on my arrival long before my family even made the reservation. As he walked briskly toward our table, my parents exchanged triumphant glances. They fully expected me to be humiliated. They were waiting for my card to be declined for the manager to ask me to step out for the ultimate proof that I was the failure they always said I was. The general manager stopped directly beside my chair. He completely ignored Preston, who was holding out a platinum card just in case I failed. He ignored my father, who was already clearing his throat to offer an apology for my lack of funds. Instead, the manager bowed his head slightly, clasping his hands behind his back. "Good evening, Miss Nora," he said, his voice carrying the utmost respect. "Is the temperature in the room still to your liking?" "It is perfect." "Thank you," I replied smoothly. I tapped the black leather folder. "We are ready to wrap up." My mother rolled her eyes. "Just run her card so we can leave," she snapped at the manager. "And let us know when it declines." The manager did not even blink at her rudeness. He kept his eyes entirely on me. "There is no need for a card, Ms. Nora," he said clearly, ensuring his voice carried across the silent table. "Your corporate account has already covered the VIP room and all associated dining expenses for the evening. And if I may be so bold, congratulations on the massive acquisition this morning. The entire hospitality group is thrilled for your continued success." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the distant clinking of silverware from the main dining floor. Savannah let out a confused, high-pitched breath. "What? What did he just say?" Preston slowly lowered his platinum card, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Corporate account. What corporate account? She is a freelancer." I smiled warmly at the manager. "Thank you. Please ensure the serving staff receives the standard 20% gratuity from the account as well." "Of course, Ms. Nora. Have a wonderful evening," he said, bowing once more before turning and exiting the room. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a sip. When I set it down, 5 pairs of eyes were staring at me in utter disbelief. The smug satisfaction had been completely wiped from my parents' faces, replaced by a rigid, uncomfortable shock. My father was the first to break the silence. He slammed his fist onto the table, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, pointing a thick finger at me. "What corporate account? Who is paying for this?" Savannah gasped, a look of manufactured disgust washing over her face. "Oh my God! Are you sleeping with someone? Is that it? Are you one of those sugar babies?" My mother gasped dramatically, clutching her pearls. "Nora, tell me you are not whoring yourself out to some rich old man for free meals. This is exactly what I mean. You have absolutely no shame. You are dragging our family name through the dirt." I looked directly into my mother's eyes, my expression hardening into stone. "I do not have a sugar daddy, Mother," I said coldly. "I paid for this dinner with my own money." "Do not lie to us," my father bellowed, standing up from his chair. "You do not have this kind of money. You live in a condo I let you stay in out of pity. If you are doing something illegal, or if you are ruining our reputation with your disgusting life choices, I swear to you right now, you are done." My mother pointed a shaking manicured finger at me. "Listen to your father, Nora. Either you tell us the truth right now, or you are written out of the family trust fund tomorrow morning. We will not tolerate a parasite in this family." I let the silence hang in the air for a brief moment, before I actually laughed. It was not a polite chuckle, but a genuine sound of amusement that echoed off the walls of the private room. My mother recoiled as if I had physically struck her, her hand flying to her chest in absolute shock. "You think this is funny?" My father bellowed, his face twisting with a deep, ugly rage. "Let us see how funny it is tomorrow morning. I am calling the building superintendent the second I wake up. I am having the locks changed on your condo. I let you live in that property out of sheer pity, hoping you would eventually get your life together. You pay me barely enough to cover the maintenance fees, and this is how you repay my generosity. You are going to be on the street by noon, Nora. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white tablecloth, completely unbothered by his screaming. Go ahead and call the building management, Dad, I said smoothly. In fact, you should call the bank while you are at it. Ask them who really owns that building. He scoffed, waving his heavy hand dismissively. I know who owns it. I hold the deed. He had absolutely no idea that his precious deed was worthless, having defaulted on the mortgage 2 years prior. He had no idea I had quietly purchased the entire building through a shell corporation to save him from public embarrassment and financial ruin. But I was not ready to drop that specific bomb just yet. I wanted to watch them dig the hole a little deeper. Preston shook his head, looking at me with a mixture of disgust and faux pity. Listen, Nora. You have pushed your parents too far. You need to apologize to them immediately. If you swallow your pride and act like an adult, maybe I can talk to human resources at Nova Data tomorrow. I could probably get you a low-level administrative job, or maybe a mailroom position. You clearly need structure and a severe reality check before you end up completely destitute. Right as Preston finished his incredibly generous offer, his cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of the table. He glanced down at the glowing screen, and his chest immediately puffed out with renewed arrogance. Speak of the devil, Preston announced, looking around the table to make sure everyone was watching him. It is Gregory, my CEO at Nova Data. He is probably calling to personally congratulate me again on the merger and finalize my new compensation package. I should take this. Let me put him on speakerphone so you all can hear what real corporate success actually sounds like. Savannah leaned in, her eyes shining with pure adoration and greed. Preston confidently tapped the green button and set the phone right in the center of the table. Hey, Gregory. Preston boasted, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. I am just finishing up an incredible dinner at Alinea. I am celebrating the big acquisition with my future in-laws. Preston, shut your damn mouth and listen to me right now. Gregory screamed through the tiny speaker. His voice was frantic, breathless, and laced with absolute terror. Where the hell are you? Have you been checking your secure company emails? Preston blinked, his arrogant smile faltering instantly. Gregory, calm down. I am at dinner like I just said. What is going on? We closed the deal this morning. Everything is finalized and the champagne is already popped. Nothing is finalized, you absolute idiot. The CEO roared, completely ignoring the fact that Preston was sitting with his family. The acquiring firm Aegis Capital just sent an independent forensic audit team into our headquarters an hour ago. They bypassed the executive lobby and went straight to the secure server rooms with federal warrants. They seized everything. Preston gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning stark white. Sweat immediately began to bead on his forehead. What do you mean they seized everything? We passed the initial financial audit weeks ago. They knew exactly where to look. Gregory yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. They found the offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. They found the inflated third-quarter user acquisition numbers that you specifically signed off on. The entire merger was a trap to get us to open our internal books. They know about the embezzled funds, Preston. They know about all of it. The entire dining table went dead silent. Savannah dropped her silver fork, the heavy metal clattering loudly against her porcelain plate. Her mouth hung open as she stared at her perfect boyfriend. My father stared at the phone as if it were a live explosive about to detonate. Jasmine looked across the table at me, her eyes widening slightly as she noticed my perfectly calm, calculated expression. The executive board is convening an emergency meeting in 10 minutes. Gregory continued, sounding like a broken man who was about to lose everything he had ever built. The federal authorities have already been notified. Do not come into the office tomorrow morning. Get yourself a defense lawyer right now. The line went dead with a sharp click. The suffocating silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Preston sat completely frozen in his chair, his face drained of all color. The smug, confident executive who had just offered me $20 out of pity was completely gone, replaced by a terrified criminal who had just been caught. Savannah was the first to find her voice. She reached out with a trembling hand to touch Preston on the arm. "Babe," she whispered, her voice wavering in the suffocating silence. "What did he mean? What shell accounts? It is just a massive misunderstanding, right?" Preston violently yanked his arm away, knocking over his half-full wineglass. The dark red liquid spilled across the white tablecloth, dripping onto the floor like blood. "Shut up, Savannah," he snarled, his voice guttural and desperate. "Just shut your mouth. You do not understand any of this." My mother gasped at his sudden aggression. "Preston, please, there is no need to raise your voice at her. We are family. We can help you figure this out." Preston stood up so abruptly, his heavy chair crashed to the hardwood floor behind him. "Family. Do you think your pathetic little Midwestern logistics company can help me fight the federal government, Diane? I am looking at 20 years in federal prison. I only tolerated these ridiculous dinners because Richard said he could give me access to his corporate accounts. I was going to use your business to move some of my assets around quietly before the audit." My father dropped his fork. His jaw went slack. "You were going to use my company to launder your stolen money." Preston ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut completely. "It does not matter now. Aegis Capital found it. They found everything. I need a defense lawyer right now." I remained perfectly still in my seat, watching his entire world and the illusion my family worshipped crumble in real time. I picked up my water glass, taking another slow sip before setting it down gently. It made a soft, deliberate clink against the table. Everyone looked at me. "Aegis Capital does not miss a decimal point, Preston," I said, my voice cutting through the panic like a cold scalpel. "And embezzling $1.4 million through ghost vendor contracts was incredibly sloppy. Even for you." Preston froze. His wild, panicked eyes locked onto mine. The rest of the table stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. My father looked from me to Preston and back again, his brain struggling to process the information. "How do you know that exact number?" Preston demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, paranoid whisper. "That number was not in any of the internal revenue reports. Only the senior board knew that number." I calmly unclasped my leather purse and pulled out my iPad. I placed it flat on the table and tapped the screen to wake it up. "Public records and sloppy digital footprints leave quite a trail if you know where to look," I replied evenly. "You left a glaring paper trail from Nova Data straight to the Cayman Islands. You used your own personal email for the wire transfers." Preston contorted his face into something monstrous. He lunged forward, placing his hands flat on the table, looming over me with pure malice. "You psychotic bitch!" he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "You did this. You hacked into my private accounts. You tipped them off because you are jealous of Savannah. You are trying to ruin my life." Rather than turning on the man who had just admitted to wanting to use their company for international money laundering, my family instinctively turned their wrath entirely on me. It was what they had done for 34 years. My mother stood up, her face twisted with absolute disgust. "Nora, how could you do this to your own sister? Are you so utterly miserable in your own pathetic life that you had to destroy her happiness? You are a monster." Savannah buried her face in her hands and began sobbing hysterically. "I knew she hated me," she wailed, her shoulders shaking violently. "She always wanted to ruin everything for me. She wants me to be alone forever." My father marched around the table, his fists clenched at his sides, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. "Give me that tablet right now, Nora," he ordered, towering over my chair. "You are going to call the federal authorities and tell them you fabricated this entire thing. You are going to fix this, or so help me God. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." Jasmine immediately stood up from her chair and stepped directly between me and my furious father. Her presence was imposing, her expression fierce and absolutely unyielding. "Back away from her, Richard," Jasmine commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "Are you all completely delusional? This man just confessed to stealing millions of dollars and trying to drag your business into a federal crime, and you are screaming at Nora. Do not tell me what to do in my own family, you insolent outsider! My father roared, raising his hand slightly as if he might actually strike her. Brandon finally jumped up, but instead of defending his wife, he grabbed Jasmine by the arm and tried to pull her away. Stop it, Jasmine, Brandon pleaded, his voice cracking with utter cowardice. You are making it worse. Just let Dad handle Nora. She brought this on herself. Jasmine violently shoved Brandon away, her eyes blazing with absolute contempt. Do not ever touch me like that again, Brandon, and do not ever mistake me for someone who will stand by and watch abuse happen. You are just as pathetic as the rest of them. Before my father could escalate his physical intimidation, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. A sharply dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped into the room. He carried a locked leather briefcase cuffed securely to his wrist. He did not look at my screaming father, my sobbing sister, or the sweating criminal at the end of the table. He walked straight past all of them and stopped respectfully beside my chair. The final injunctions are ready for your signature, boss, he said, his voice crisp and entirely professional. The word hung in the air, heavy and completely foreign to my family. Boss. For a moment, the only sound in the private dining room was the frantic, ragged breathing of Preston, who was still staring at me like I was a ghost. My mother, Diane, was the first to shatter the silence. Her brain simply refused to process the reality unfolding in front of her. Instead of connecting the dots, she doubled down on her own twisted narrative. She looked Harrison up and down, taking in his expensive suit, and the security earpiece tucked discreetly behind his ear. Is this him? Nora? My mother demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with venom. Is this the man paying for your dinners? Or worse, is he your handler? Harrison did not even flinch. He kept his eyes fixed respectfully on me, completely ignoring the hysterical woman across the table. I gave him a slight nod, instructing him to place the briefcase on the table. My mother stepped forward, her face contorted with disgust. I will not tolerate this silence, Nora. If you are whoring yourself out, you are written out of the family trust fund tomorrow morning. I am calling the family lawyers first thing in the morning. I will not let you drag our family name through the mud with this disgusting, immoral double life you have built. You are a disgrace. Savannah, desperately trying to deflect from the fact that her perfect boyfriend had just admitted to federal crimes, latched onto my mother's attack like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. She let out a brittle, manic laugh that echoed sharply in the room. Exactly, Mom Savannah chimed in, her voice trembling slightly despite her cruel words. Cut her off completely. It is not like Nora would even know what to do with trust fund money anyway. She would probably just buy more cheap suits and pretend to be important. Look at her trying to stage this ridiculous little play to take the attention away from me and Preston. You are pathetic, Nora. My father pounded his fist on the table again, nodding in agreement with his wife and golden child. You heard your mother. You are finished in this family. You think you can parade your illicit affairs in front of us and threaten Preston with fake corporate espionage. You are cut off. You will not see a single penny of the family wealth. Jasmine looked at them with a mixture of absolute horror and profound pity. Are you all completely insane? Jasmine asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. The FBI is literally raiding Preston's office. He just confessed to international fraud, and you are threatening Nora over a trust fund. Your priorities are sick. You are living in a complete delusion. I held up my hand, stopping Jasmine before my father could turn his rage back on her. It is fine, Jasmine, I said softly. Let them talk. I turned my attention to the leather briefcase. Harrison smoothly entered the combination, the brass locks clicking open with a satisfying heavy sound. I lifted the lid, revealing neat stacks of legal documents on heavy watermarked paper. I looked up at my mother, who was still glaring at me with self-righteous indignation. You cannot write me out of the family trust fund, Mom, I said, my voice dangerously calm. My mother scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. Watch me. Richard, call the attorney right now. Put it on speaker. Let her hear it. You cannot write me out of the trust fund because there is no trust fund left. I continued my words, hitting the room like physical blows. My mother froze. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides. What are you talking about? I reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thin blue folder. I tossed it onto the table. It slid to a stop right in front of her. I suggest you open that, Mom. It is a certified bank statement from yesterday. Dad drained the family trust fund 18 months ago to keep his failing logistics company afloat. Every single penny meant for Savannah and me is gone. He liquidated the assets, remortgaged the summer house, and funneled it all into payroll, just to delay his inevitable bankruptcy. My father went completely rigid. The color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tailored suit. Richard, my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. Tell me she is lying. Tell me she fabricated that document too. My father could not speak. He just stared at the blue folder as if it were a venomous snake. Savannah let out a choked gasp, stepping away from our father. No! No! That is my money. That was for my wedding. I am afraid your wedding is the least of your problems right now, Savannah, I said coldly. I reached back into the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound by a heavy legal clip. I turned my gaze away from my shattered parents and locked eyes with Preston, who was sweating profusely, his chest heaving with panic. I slid the heavy stack of documents across the polished wood. They came to a stop directly against Preston's chest. Those are your termination papers, Preston. I announced the authority in my voice, leaving absolutely no room for debate. Effective immediately. And you should know that Aegis Capital does not just fire thieves. We prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. The copies you are looking at are just for your records. The originals were handed over to the FBI field office an hour ago. Preston looked down at the documents. The letterhead was unmistakable. The thick embossed logo of Aegis Capital sat right above his full legal name, followed by the words, "Immediate termination with cause." He fell back into his chair, gasping for air, as if the room had suddenly been completely drained of oxygen. He looked at Savannah, then at my father, and finally back at me. His arrogant, superior facade had been completely obliterated, leaving nothing but a terrified, broken man staring at the true architect of his downfall. Preston was broken. Savannah began to shake his shoulder aggressively, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Preston, say something, she cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. Tell them she is lying. Tell them this is just a stupid prank. Preston could not speak. He simply buried his face in his hands, completely defeated by the undeniable reality of his own criminal actions. He knew Aegis Capital had him dead to rights. My father, however, was a man who had spent his entire life bullying people into submission. He had never lost an argument because he simply shouted over everyone else until they gave up. Seeing his golden boy dismantled and his own financial crimes regarding the family trust fund exposed completely broke his brain. He could not accept that the daughter he viewed as a pathetic loser was sitting at the head of the table holding all the cards. He marched around this table, his chest heaving, his face a mask of desperate, furious denial. This is absolute garbage, my father spat, slapping his heavy hand down on the stack of termination papers. You printed these out at your little apartment. You hired some actor to walk in here with a briefcase to scare us. Aegis Capital would never hire a freelance typist, let alone be run by one. You are nothing but a jealous, vindictive liar. Jasmine stood up again, her eyes blazing, ready to defend me. Brandon immediately pulled her arm, whispering frantically for her to stay out of it. I raised my hand, signaling Jasmine to let him dig his own grave. She reluctantly sat back down. You think you can come to a family dinner and pull a stunt like this? My father raged, his voice echoing off the expensive wood paneling. I am done with you, Nora. I am completely done. I am calling the building superintendent tomorrow morning to change the locks on that apartment. My mother nodded enthusiastically from her seat. Yes, Richard. Throw her out. Let her see what the real world is like without our charity. I let you live there out of pity. My father continued, leaning over my chair, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. I paid the down payment on that condo. I hold the deed. I let you stay there because I felt sorry for you. I kept a roof over your head. But as of tomorrow, you are evicted. You can pack your cheap suits in a garbage bag and sleep on the street for all I care. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs elegantly. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not shrink away. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. Go ahead and call the bank, Dad, I said smoothly. My father sneered, crossing his massive arms over his chest. I do not need to call the bank. I own the property outright. I make the rules. You do not own anything, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, deadly calm that commanded the entire room. You have not owned that property for over 2 years. His sneer faltered. He blinked, the absolute certainty in his eyes wavering just a little. What the hell are you talking about? I have the deed in my office safe. A deed is just a piece of paper when you stop paying the mortgage, Dad, I explained, speaking slowly, as if addressing a particularly slow child. You took out a massive second mortgage on that condo to cover payroll for your failing logistics company. Then you missed 4 consecutive payments. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings 26 months ago. They were going to seize the property and publicly list it on the market. My mother gasped, looking at her husband in absolute horror. Richard, is that true? Did you put her apartment up as collateral behind my back? My father ignored her, staring intensely at me, a bead of cold sweat forming on his temple. You are lying. Nobody evicted us. The bank sent a modification letter. They sold the debt to a private holding company, and I have been paying them directly ever since. You have been paying an LLC called Horizon Properties, I clarified, watching his pupils dilate as the realization slowly began to set in. Horizon Properties is a subsidiary shell company created by Aegis Capital. I bought your defaulted mortgage, Dad. I bought the entire building. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping heavily into Savannah's empty chair. No. No, that is impossible. It is entirely possible, and it is a matter of public record. I continued, relentlessly leaning forward to deliver the final blow. I let you believe you still owned it because I knew the moment you realized you were bankrupt, you would try to bleed my sister dry next. You have been paying rent to me for the past 2 years, so if anyone is calling the superintendent tomorrow to change the locks, it will be me. The absolute devastation on his face was something I had waited a lifetime to see. The big, powerful patriarch of the family had just been reduced to a tenant living on my good graces. My father stared at me, his jaw slack, the absolute certainty that had defined his entire life completely evaporating. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized there was no ground beneath him. Diane. My mother slowly turned her head to look at him. The pristine aristocratic mask she wore so carefully was slipping. Richard, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rising fury. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not gamble away our home and the girls' trust funds. He could not even look at her. He stared at the polished mahogany table, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He had always been the loudest man in the room, the one who controlled everyone through financial intimidation. Now he had absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. Savannah, sensing the absolute collapse of her perfect family narrative, began to hyperventilate. She whipped her head around, her perfectly styled hair flying across her face, and desperately grabbed Preston by the shoulders. Preston, do something, she shrieked. You are a senior vice president. You have money. You can fix this. Tell them you will buy the building. Preston was barely holding it together himself. His tailored suit, which had looked so sharp an hour ago, now seemed to hang off him like a cheap costume. His eyes were darting around the room, completely feral. Before my father could find his voice to explode, before Savannah could launch into another hysterical fit, the heavy, suffocating silence in the room was pierced by a sharp electronic buzzing. Preston's cell phone was vibrating violently against the table once again. We all stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID simply read, Nova Data Executive Board. Preston stared at this device. A terrifying delusional shift happened behind his eyes. His mind, unable to process the sheer magnitude of his ruin, violently rejected reality. He let out a manic, breathless laugh and grabbed the phone. See? Preston stammered, his eyes wide and unhinged as he looked around the table. Gregory was just overreacting earlier. It is just a routine compliance check. They are calling me to apologize. They need me. I am the only one who understands the transition architecture. He was desperately eager to impress Richard and Savannah, clinging to the last shredded pieces of his elite corporate status. He wanted to prove that I was just a bitter liar. With a trembling finger, he pressed the green button and aggressively hit the speakerphone icon, placing the phone right in the center of the table. "Hey, gentlemen," Preston boasted, though his voice cracked pathetically on the first syllable. "I am just finishing up celebrating the acquisition with my future in-laws. What can I do for you?" The voice that echoed through the speaker was not Gregory, the CEO. It was a cold, unfamiliar baritone that carried absolute, unforgiving authority. "Preston, this is Chief Financial Officer William Davies," the voice said flatly. "I am sitting in the boardroom with the federal forensic accountants from Aegis Capital. You are not celebrating anything tonight." Preston swallowed hard, his manic smile faltering. "William, listen, whatever Gregory told you, he is panicking over standard operating procedures. I can explain the vendor contracts." "There is nothing to explain," William cut him off, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "The proxy servers you set up to hide the transfers were bypassed 30 minutes ago. The auditors have hard copies of every single wire transfer you authorized to the offshore accounts. They even found the emails where you instructed the accounting team to alter the quarterly projections. You did not just cook the books, Preston. You incinerated them." Savannah let out a small, terrified whimper, shrinking back in her chair. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with undisguised horror. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, folding her arms as she watched the destruction unfold. She glanced at Brandon silently, daring him to try and defend Preston now. "William, please, Preston," begged, all pretense of arrogance completely vanishing. His voice was reduced to a pathetic whine. "I was going to put the money back. I just needed to float it until my stock options vested. If you just give me 24 hours, I swear I can make the accounts balance." "You do not have 24 hours, William stated coldly. "Aegis Capital has officially filed criminal charges. The acquisition deal is frozen, and the entire executive board is facing federal scrutiny because of your unmitigated greed. Security has already boxed up your office." Preston began to hyperventilate, his hand clutching the expensive fabric over his chest. "And Preston," William added, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "The legal team from Aegis sent someone to personally deliver your termination papers. They explicitly instructed us to tell you that the CEO of Aegis does not negotiate with thieves. Do not try to run. The authorities have your license plate and your passport has been flagged. If you have a shred of dignity left, you will wait right where you are and turn yourself in." The line went dead, leaving nothing but the sound of Preston gasping for air in the silent room. The contrast between the luxurious setting of Alinea and the absolute degradation of the people sitting at the table was staggering. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead, casting warm, inviting light over a family that was completely tearing itself apart from the inside out. The phone screen went black, plunging the room back into an oppressive, terrifying silence. Preston stared at the device resting on the white tablecloth as if it had just pronounced his death sentence. His chest heaved violently under his expensive tailored suit. The illusion of the untouchable corporate titan was entirely shattered, leaving behind a pathetic, cornered criminal. Savannah was shaking uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her meticulously applied makeup. She reached out her hand, trembling, and gently touched his arm. "Preston?" she whispered, her voice barely a squeak. "What are we going to do? You can fix this, right?" "You told me you were invincible," Preston snapped. The last thread of his sanity broke, and the handsome, charming facade he had worn all evening morphed into something utterly repulsive. He violently swatted her hand away, hitting her wrist hard enough to make her gasp in pain. "Do not touch me," he hissed, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "This is your fault. You and your pathetic, money-hungry family. You distracted me. You were constantly demanding expensive dinners, designer bags, and luxury vacations. If I had not been so busy trying to keep up with your ridiculous lifestyle, I would have had time to properly scrub the proxy servers." Savannah recoiled as if she had been struck across the face. She let out a loud, ugly sob, burying her face in her hands. "He is blaming me," she wailed, looking toward our mother for comfort. "Mom, he is blaming me." Diane immediately stood up, her maternal instincts finally kicking in, though entirely misplaced as usual. "How dare you speak to my daughter that way?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Preston. "You are a fraud. You came into our home, drank our wine, and promised her the world. And now you are going to drag her into a federal scandal. What about the country club, Preston? What about the wedding announcements we already sent out? You have completely ruined us socially." Preston let out a harsh barking laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "Socially, Diane. I am about to be indicted for international wire fraud and embezzlement. I do not care about your stupid country club. I only dated your shallow, airheaded daughter because Richard bragged about his offshore logistics accounts at a golf tournament. I needed a clean company to wash my money through before the Aegis acquisition happened. I was going to use your idiot husband, and then I was going to drop Savannah the second the funds cleared." The brutality of his confession hung in the air. Savannah stopped crying and stared at him, her mouth hanging open in pure devastation. She had built her entire identity around being the beautiful, successful, golden child who had secured a millionaire fiancé. Now she was nothing but a pawn in a federal crime. My father, however, was incapable of accepting defeat. His massive ego simply would not allow him to surrender to the reality of the situation. He slammed both of his hands onto the table, leaning forward with desperate aggression. "Listen to me, Preston," my father barked, trying to regain control of the room. "We can still salvage this. My corporate lawyers are the best in Chicago. I have guys who specialize in white-collar defense. We will pool our resources. Aegis Capital is just a private equity firm. They are bullies in suits. We can tie them up in litigation for years. We just need to get our stories straight right now." Jasmine, who had been watching the entire exchange with absolute disgust, finally slammed her own hand against the table. "Are you completely out of your mind, Richard?" she yelled, her voice echoing loudly. "This man just stood there and admitted to using your daughter. He admitted he was planning to use your failing company to commit federal money laundering, and your first instinct is to offer him your lawyers. You are willing to go to federal prison just to save face." Brandon grabbed Jasmine by the waist, trying to pull her back into her chair. "Shut up!" "Jasmine," Brandon hissed, his face pale with fear. "Dad knows what he is doing. If Preston goes down, he might drag our company down with him. We have to help him." "You are all pathetic," Jasmine spat, shoving Brandon away with a look of profound contempt. "You deserve exactly what is coming to you." I sat perfectly still, observing the spectacular implosion of the family that had tormented me for 3 decades. They were literally clawing at each other like rats on a sinking ship. My father was willing to commit a felony to save his ego. My mother was mourning her social status. My sister was mourning her vanity. And Preston was drowning in his own greed. I reached for my glass of sparkling water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. The sound drew everyone's attention back to me. They had almost forgotten I was sitting at the head of the table. "You cannot fight Aegis Capital, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through their hysterical screaming like a sharp blade. "Your corporate lawyers are cheap ambulance chasers compared to the legal team I have on retainer." Preston whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto me with absolute hatred. "Why do you keep talking like you know them?" he growled, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why did William say someone was bringing my termination papers?" "Because I am the one who sent them," I replied, my expression completely blank. And you really should have checked the background of the CEO who just bought your company, Preston. You might have recognized the name." Preston's hands shook violently as he reached across the table and snatched the heavy stack of termination papers. He had been so blinded by his own panic that he had not even bothered to look at the signature on the final page. Now his bloodshot eyes frantically scanned the heavy black ink at the bottom of the document. He read the printed name below the signature line out loud, his voice barely a raspy whisper. Nora Hastings, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. He dropped the papers as if they had suddenly caught fire. The thick packet hit the crystal water glass, knocking it over and sending a stream of cold water soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. Preston stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute terror and unhinged rage. "This is a joke," Preston stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is some kind of elaborate sick setup. You do not own Aegis Capital. You type data into spreadsheets in a cheap apartment. You do not have the capital to buy out a massive tech firm." My father, who had been standing frozen near his chair, finally seemed to process the magnitude of what was happening. His eyes darted from the termination papers on the table to my perfectly calm expression. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The daughter he had spent 34 years treating like an absolute failure was the unseen titan who had just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar corporate takeover. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. His entire demeanor shifted with sickening speed. The aggressive, bullying patriarch vanished, replaced instantly by a groveling, desperate businessman who smelled an opportunity for salvation. "Nora," my father said, his voice suddenly taking on a soft, pleading tone that I had never heard directed at me in my entire life. "Is this true? Are you really the head of Aegis Capital? Have you been running this massive private equity firm the whole time?" I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "I started Aegis 7 years ago, Dad," I replied smoothly. "I built it from the ground up while you were busy telling everyone I was a lost cause. I did not want your money, and I certainly did not want your approval. I wanted independence. And now I own the company that was about to make your golden boy a millionaire." Preston let out a guttural scream of frustration. He grabbed his hair, pulling at the expensive styled strands. He paced back and forth near the heavy oak doors, completely ignoring Savannah, who was still sobbing quietly into her hands. "You ruined me!" Preston yelled, spinning around to face me. I had everything lined up. The offshore accounts were untraceable. I was going to be set for life. You targeted me on purpose. You bought Nova Data just to destroy my career because you could not stand seeing Savannah happy. You give yourself entirely too much credit, Preston," I said coldly. Aegis Capital targets bloated, poorly managed companies with corrupt executive boards. Nova Data matched our acquisition criteria perfectly. You were just a highly convenient bonus. We were tracking your embezzlement for 3 weeks before the merger even finalized. You were incredibly arrogant, and arrogance makes people incredibly stupid. Savannah raised her head, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. She looked at our father with desperate, pleading eyes. "Dad, you have to do something," she cried out. "You said you had lawyers. You said you could fix this. If Preston goes to prison, what happens to me? What about the wedding? What about the house in the Gold Coast he promised me?" Jasmine let out a sharp, incredulous laugh from across the table. "Are you actually hearing yourself right now?" Savannah Jasmine asked, shaking her head in pure disbelief. "Your fiancé is a confirmed criminal who just admitted he was using you and your family for money laundering. He is going to federal prison, and you are crying about a wedding and a hypothetical mansion. You are completely disconnected from reality." Brandon immediately turned on Jasmine again, his face red with embarrassment. "Stop it, Jasmine," he snapped. "Do not kick her while she is down. She is the victim here." Jasmine stood up slowly, her chair sliding back with a soft thud. She looked down at Brandon with an expression of absolute finality. "No, Brandon," she said quietly. "Savannah is not a victim. She is a spoiled brat mourning the loss of a credit card limit. And you are a coward who will always defend this toxic family over your own wife." My father ignored all of them. He took a step toward me, a sickening, hopeful smile spreading across his face. "Nora, my brilliant girl," he said, holding his hands out as if he wanted to embrace me. "If you own Aegis Capital, then you have the resources to save us. You can bail out my logistics company. We are facing bankruptcy next month. You can fix everything. You can save your own family." I stared at my father's outstretched hands. The sheer audacity of his request hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Just an hour ago, he had been standing over me, his face twisted with rage, threatening to throw me out onto the street. He had called me a parasite. He had threatened to have me arrested for corporate espionage, and now armed with the knowledge of my immense wealth, he was looking at me as if I were his personal savior. "Save your family," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue as if testing their bitter taste. That is a fascinating choice of words, Dad. Because from where I have been sitting for the past 34 years, I was never part of this family. I was the scapegoat. I was the cautionary tale you used to make Savannah feel better about her own shallow existence. My father dropped his hands, his posture shrinking as he desperately tried a different tactic. He attempted a warm, fatherly chuckle, but it sounded wet and terrified in his throat. "Nora, you misunderstood us," he stammered, his eyes darting to my mother for support. "Everything we did, all the harsh words, it was just tough love. We always saw your potential. We were just pushing you to be the shark you clearly are today. We made you strong." My mother immediately latched onto his pathetic attempt at gaslighting. She leaned across the table, offering me a sickeningly sweet smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. "Exactly, sweetheart," she cooed, her voice trembling. "We are so incredibly proud of you. You proved us wrong, and that is a wonderful thing. Now that the truth is out, we can finally be a real family. We can pool our resources, you can fix the logistics company, and we can put all of this ugliness behind us." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire childhood painting my room the wrong color just to exert control, the woman who had told me not to embarrass her mere hours ago. I reached back into the leather briefcase that Harrison had left open on the table. I did not pull out a checkbook. Instead, I pulled out a heavy red folder. "I do not need to pool resources with a sinking ship, Mom," I said smoothly, tossing the red folder onto the polished wood. It slid to a halt right over the spilled wine. My father stared at the folder, his hands visibly shaking as he reached out and opened the cover. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That is the comprehensive commercial debt portfolio for your logistics company," I explained, leaning back and watching the last remnants of his pride evaporate. "Wells Fargo classified your business as a toxic asset 6 months ago. You have been running at a massive deficit, bleeding capital, and making horrific logistical errors. The bank was preparing to force you into Chapter 11 bankruptcy and liquidate your trucks to cover the outstanding loans. But they did not," my father argued weakly, his eyes frantically scanning the heavily redacted financial jargon. "They sold the debt to a private equity buyer. They sent me a notice. They sold it to Aegis Capital," I corrected him, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "I am your primary creditor, Dad. I hold the paper on your entire fleet, your warehouses, and your corporate headquarters." The color completely drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death certificate. "And because you illegally liquidated the family trust fund to cover your operating expenses without notifying your creditors, you are in direct violation of your financial covenants," I continued relentlessly. "Therefore, as of 5 o'clock this evening, Aegis Capital has initiated a full asset seizure. Your corporate accounts are frozen. The locks on the warehouses have already been changed by private security. Your logistics company belongs to me now, and my first act as the new owner is to formally dissolve the entity and sell the assets for scrap." Savannah let out a blood-curdling shriek. She stood up, knocking her chair backward. "My wedding!" she screamed, clutching the sides of her head. The deposits for the country club were in that corporate account. The florist, the caterer, everything. You cannot do this to me, Nora. Where are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to survive? You will have to figure it out just like I did when you all decided I was not worth your time, I replied coldly. Brandon, my brother, who had remained spineless and quiet throughout the entire ordeal, finally broke. He rushed toward me, tears streaming down his face. Nora, please, he begged, his voice cracking. I work for Dad. I am the regional manager. Jasmine and I need the income. We have a mortgage. You cannot just wipe out my job because you are mad at Mom and Dad. Before I could even respond to his pathetic plea, Jasmine stood up. She walked calmly around the table and stopped right beside Brandon. She reached out, took his hand, and looked deeply into his eyes. No, Brandon. Jasmine said, her voice completely steady and filled with absolute resolve. You need the income. I am completely done. Brandon froze, his tear-filled eyes widening in confusion. Jazz, what are you doing? He panicked. Jasmine reached for her left hand. In one fluid motion, she slid her diamond wedding ring off her finger. The gold band clinked softly as she dropped it directly onto the stack of Preston's termination papers. I am leaving a man who would rather watch his wife be verbally abused than stand up to his toxic parents, Jasmine said, stepping away from him. I am leaving this suffocating, miserable family. Brandon fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. My parents were too paralyzed by their own financial ruin to even comfort him. I looked at Jasmine, feeling a profound sense of respect for the woman who had just reclaimed her life. Jasmine, I said, offering her a genuine warm smile. Aegis Capital is currently headhunting for a new vice president of operations. I need someone with an iron will and a flawless moral compass. The starting salary is $400,000 a year, plus full equity options. Are you interested? Jasmine smiled back, the weight of the world completely lifting from her shoulders. I accept, boss. Let us get out of here. Jasmine reached for her purse, her posture perfectly straight, radiating a confidence I had never seen in her before. Brandon stared at the gold ring sitting on top of the termination papers, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He reached out to grab her wrist, a pathetic last-ditch effort to maintain control over the only good thing he had in his miserable life. Do not touch me, Brandon. Jasmine warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You made your choice years ago, when you decided to let them treat me like an outsider. Now you get to stay inside with them. Enjoy the sinking ship. She stepped around him, walking gracefully to my side. I picked up my charcoal blazer from the back of my chair and slipped it on. The fabric felt like armor. I looked around the room one last time. The luxurious VIP dining area of Alinea, with its sparkling chandeliers and pristine white walls, looked like the scene of a brutal massacre. My father was still staring blindly at the red folder containing the foreclosure documents for his logistics company. His massive chest heaved, but he made no sound. The realization that he was entirely bankrupt, that his legacy was completely erased, had broken something fundamental inside his brain. My mother, however, was not ready to surrender her delusions. Seeing Jasmine stand beside me ready to walk out finally triggered the survival instincts she usually reserved for country club disputes. Diane scrambled up from her chair, her pearl necklace bouncing wildly against her chest. She practically threw herself across the room, planting herself firmly in front of the heavy oak doors, physically blocking our exit. Nora, you cannot do this, my mother shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. You cannot just walk in here, destroy our lives, and leave. We are your family. I am your mother. I carried you. I raised you. You owe us. You owe your sister. I stopped a few feet away from her. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sadness. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman standing in front of me. You did not raise me, Mom, I said calmly. You housed me. You fed me. But you spent every single day of my childhood making sure I knew I was a disappointment. You let Savannah tear up my homework. You let Dad belittle my grades. You told me my ambitions were embarrassing. You painted my room a color I hated, just to remind me that my preferences did not matter in your house. Diane shook her head frantically, tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. We were just trying to prepare you for the real world, she sobbed, reaching out to grab my arm. I stepped back, avoiding her touch as if it were toxic. And you did an excellent job, I replied smoothly. The real world is ruthless. It is full of sharks and corporate predators. Because of you, I learned how to swim with them. Because of Dad, I learned how to identify financial weakness. And because of Savannah, I learned how to spot a fraud from a mile away. So thank you. Your horrific parenting created the CEO standing in front of you today. Savannah let out a loud, agonizing wail from the table. She pointed an accusing finger at our parents. This is your fault, she screamed at them. You told me we were rich. You told me I did not have to work because the trust fund would cover my lifestyle. You lied to me. You spent my wedding money on your stupid failing company. My father finally snapped out of his catatonic state. Shut up, Savannah, he roared, his face turning purple again. I did it to keep a roof over your head. If you were not so incredibly useless, maybe you could have helped the business instead of maxing out credit cards. The golden child illusion shattered completely. Savannah picked up her half-empty wineglass and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the mahogany-paneled wall, sending red wine splattering across the expensive wallpaper like blood. You are a failure, Dad, she screamed. You lost everything. While my family tore each other to pieces, Preston saw an opportunity. He slowly backed away from the table, trying to inch along the wall toward the doors. He thought the chaos would cover his escape. He was wrong. Harrison, my assistant, stepped effortlessly into his path, blocking the terrified executive. Going somewhere, Preston? Harrison asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Get out of my way, Preston hissed, his eyes darting frantically around the room. I need to call my lawyer. I am leaving. I turned to look at the man who had offered me a $20 bill out of pity just an hour ago. You can call your lawyer from the lobby, Preston, I said. But I would not recommend making any sudden movements. The FBI field agents are waiting for you by the valet stand. They requested that we keep you in the VIP room, but I told them you might try to run. It seems I was right. Preston clamped his hands over his mouth, his knees visibly buckling. He slid down the wall, collapsing into a pathetic heap on the hardwood floor. He was hyperventilating, completely paralyzed by the reality of federal prison. I looked back at my mother, who was still standing in front of the doors, trembling violently. Move, Diane, I commanded. She looked into my eyes and finally saw the absolute truth. I was not the scared little girl she used to bully. I was a force of nature that she could no longer control. Slowly, her shoulders slumped. She stepped aside, burying her face in her hands as she began to sob uncontrollably. Harrison opened the heavy oak doors for us. I stepped out of the VIP room, leaving the screaming, crying, broken remains of my toxic family behind me. Jasmine walked right beside me, her head held high. We did not look back, not even once. We had barely made it 10 paces down the softly lit corridor of the restaurant when the heavy oak doors of the VIP room burst open behind us. The violent thud of wood hitting the wall echoed sharply, drawing the immediate attention of the discreet waitstaff and several affluent patrons seated near the main dining area. I did not stop walking. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor that bordered the plush carpet. Jasmine matched my stride perfectly, her posture exuding a newfound, undeniable liberation. "Stop right there!" Savannah shrieked, her voice tearing through the refined atmosphere of Alinea like a jagged knife. I paused and slowly turned around. Savannah was storming down the hallway toward us. Her expensive silk dress was wrinkled, and her face was a twisted mask of desperation and misplaced rage. Behind her, my mother and father were practically sprinting to catch up. Instead of turning their anger toward the man who had just admitted to orchestrating a massive financial fraud, their collective delusion had immediately redirected their fury back to their favorite target. Me. You framed him, Savannah screamed, stopping just a few feet away and pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. You are a psychotic hacker. You could not stand the fact that I was going to marry a millionaire. You knew he was successful, so you called the SEC and fed them a bunch of fabricated lies just to ruin my life. You set him up because you have always been insanely jealous of me. The sheer absurdity of her accusation was almost laughable. She was standing mere yards away from a man who was currently hyperventilating on the floor because the FBI had seized his stolen assets, yet her fragile ego demanded that I be the villain. My mother arrived breathless, her pearl necklace askew. She immediately threw a protective arm around Savannah's shaking shoulders and glared at me with absolute revulsion. Savannah is right. Diane spat, her voice trembling with toxic indignation. You have always been a vindictive, spiteful little girl. You staged this entire spectacle tonight. You brought those fake documents and hired that man to play a lawyer just to humiliate us in public. You are deliberately trying to tear this family apart out of pure malice. I looked at Diane, marveling at the Olympic-level mental gymnastics she was performing to protect her false reality. You just watched Preston confess to international money laundering, Mom, I said calmly. He told you he was going to use Dad's company to hide the stolen funds. He told you he was going to dump Savannah. But you would rather believe that I orchestrated a multi-million-dollar federal raid just to ruin a dinner party. Your commitment to your own ignorance is truly staggering. My father shoved past Diane and Savannah, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. His heavy footsteps thudded against the floor as he closed the distance between us. His eyes dropped to the leather purse hanging from my shoulder where I had stowed my tablet just moments before. His panic had completely overridden his logic. Give me that iPad right now. Nora, Richard bellowed, raising his hand aggressively. I am going to see exactly what lies you typed up. I am going to delete whatever files you sent to the authorities, and then we are going into damage control. Hand it over before I take it from you myself. He lunged forward, his massive frame moving with frightening speed. He fully intended to physically overpower me, to get his hands on the device, clinging to the delusional hope that deleting a file on an iPad would somehow stop a federal investigation and save his bankrupt company. Before his heavy hand could even graze my shoulder, Jasmine stepped directly into his path. She moved with blinding speed, planting her feet firmly and raising both of her hands to shove Richard hard in the chest. The impact forced my father to stumble backward, completely stunned by the physical resistance. Back the hell off, Richard, Jasmine commanded, her voice ringing out with absolute unwavering authority. Do not take another step toward her. My father stared at Jasmine, his jaw slack with shock. You dare put your hands on me, he growled, stepping forward again. Jasmine did not flinch. She stood tall, a fierce protector, completely unbothered by his bullying tactics. Try to touch her again and see what happens. Jasmine warned, her dark eyes flashing with intense fury. You are a pathetic, cowardly old man. Your entire world is burning to the ground because of your own greed and stupidity, and you are out here in a hallway trying to attack your daughter over a piece of glass and metal. You think deleting an email is going to stop Aegis Capital. You think smashing a tablet is going to stop the FBI. You are completely pathetic. I placed a gentle hand on Jasmine's shoulder, silently thanking her, before looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. She is right, Dad, I said softly. The iPad is just a screen. The data is on secure servers, and the authorities already have it. There is nothing you can do to stop what is coming. It is over. My father stared at me, the words echoing in the luxurious hallway. The sheer finality of my statement should have broken through his delusions, but a man who has relied on physical intimidation his entire life does not surrender easily. He let out a low, guttural growl, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He recovered his balance from Jasmine's shove, his massive shoulders tensing under his suit jacket. You ungrateful little wretch! Richard snarled, stepping forward with his hand raised high, fully intending to strike Jasmine out of his way to get to me. I will teach you how to speak to your father. Right as his hand reached its apex before he could bring it down, the polished silver doors of the private elevator at the end of the corridor chimed loudly. The elegant ping cut through the tension like a gunshot. The doors slid open, revealing a sharply dressed man in a flawless navy blue tailored suit. He stepped onto the plush carpet carrying a heavy locked leather briefcase. This was Carter, the senior legal counsel for Aegis Capital. He was a man who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers and had absolutely zero tolerance for family drama. He walked down the hallway with long, purposeful strides, his eyes locked entirely on me. He completely ignored my screaming mother, my sobbing sister, and the towering, furious figure of my father. Carter stepped smoothly between Richard and me, his presence radiating an icy, untouchable professionalism that immediately derailed my father's violent momentum. The final injunctions are ready for your signature, boss, Carter said, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet hallway. He rested the leather briefcase on a sleek marble credenza against the wall and quickly spun the brass combination dials. The heavy latches clicked open with a satisfying snap. My father stood frozen, his hands still awkwardly suspended in the air. The absolute disrespect of being entirely ignored by this high-powered attorney seemed to short-circuit his brain. He slowly lowered his arm, his eyes darting from the open briefcase to my perfectly calm expression. I stepped up to the credenza, took the gold pen Carter offered me, and quickly signed the bottom of the 3 heavily watermarked legal documents. Excellent, Carter said, carefully organizing the signed papers. He then reached into the side pocket of the briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He turned around for the first time, finally acknowledging the existence of the man standing a few feet away. "Are you Richard Carter?" asked, his tone flat and entirely devoid of warmth. My father puffed out his chest, trying to summon whatever shreds of authority he had left. "Yes, I am. And who the hell are you to interrupt a private family conversation?" Carter did not introduce himself. He simply stepped forward and pressed the heavy envelope directly against my father's chest. "Richard, you are hereby formally served," Carter announced, his voice carrying the lethal weight of federal law. "These are the immediate injunctions filed by Aegis Capital. Your logistics company is now officially under corporate receivership. Your physical access to all commercial warehouses, executive offices, and corporate bank accounts has been fully revoked as of 5 minutes ago." My father instinctively grabbed the envelope before it could fall, his hands trembling violently. He stared down at the thick manila package as if it were a live grenade. The bluster, the rage, the physical intimidation, all of it vanished instantly. He was no longer the terrifying patriarch of the family. He was just a bankrupt, broken man, holding the legal proof of his own demise. Diane let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She rushed to his side, her perfectly manicured hands clutching his arm. "Richard, tell him he is wrong," she pleaded, her voice cracking with absolute terror. "Tell him our lawyers will destroy him." My father did not speak. He could not even look at her. He clumsily tore open the envelope, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal jargon printed on the first page. I watched the remaining color completely drain from his face. The official court seals, the federal docket numbers, the undeniable signature of a federal judge authorizing the immediate seizure of his life's work. It was all there. "This cannot be happening," Richard whispered, his voice incredibly small and fragile. "I built that company from nothing. You cannot just take it away from me, Nora." "You took it away from yourself, Dad," I replied coldly. "You ran it into the ground, stole from your own children to cover your mistakes, and then tried to use it to launder money for a criminal. Aegis Capital is simply cleaning up your horrific mess." Savannah, realizing that the family wealth she had always relied upon was genuinely gone, collapsed against the hallway wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor in her expensive silk dress. She wrapped her arms around her knees, sobbing loudly, completely ignoring the stares of the affluent restaurant patrons who had gathered near the entrance to watch the spectacle. The general manager of Alinea appeared from the main dining room accompanied by two large security guards. He looked at my family with an expression of profound distaste. "I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately," the manager said to my parents, "or I will be forced to call the police for causing a public disturbance." It was the ultimate humiliation for my mother. Being escorted out of an exclusive Michelin star restaurant by security was a social death sentence she would never recover from. The two large security guards did not leave room for negotiation. They stepped forward, their sheer physical presence forcing my parents and Savannah to take several steps back toward the VIP dining room. The general manager stood behind them, his face a mask of absolute professional disdain. "Please gather your coats and personal belongings," the manager instructed, his tone ice cold. "You will be escorted out through the rear service exit." I will not have my other guests subjected to this circus. The service exit. My mother looked as though she had just been told she was going to be publicly executed. The idea of being paraded past the kitchen staff, walking past dumpsters, and being thrown out the back door was completely unfathomable to her. She opened her mouth to argue, drawing a breath to demand the respect she felt she was owed, but my father grabbed her arm. His grip was loose and utterly defeated. "Just do what he says," Diane Richard muttered, his voice hollow. He was still clutching the manila envelope Carter had handed him, holding the notice of his own corporate foreclosure against his chest like a useless shield. We all moved slowly back into the private dining room. The space that had felt so triumphant just an hour ago now felt like a tomb. The spilled red wine had soaked completely into the white tablecloth. Preston was still on the floor near the wall, clutching his knees, his expensive suit wrinkled and pathetic. One of the security guards reached down, grabbed Preston by the shoulder, and hauled him to his feet, shoving him roughly toward his chair at the dining table. Preston collapsed into the seat, his head hanging low, his breathing erratic. Carter stood beside the marble credenza where his open leather briefcase rested. He reached inside and pulled out one final, incredibly thick stack of documents. They were bound by a heavy black legal clip and stamped with bright red federal seals. He turned and handed the massive stack directly to me. I walked over to the dining table. Preston did not even look up. He was staring blankly at the ruined tablecloth. I unlocked the heavy black legal clip, raised the stack of legal documents, and tossed them onto the polished wood. They slid rapidly across the smooth surface, colliding right into Preston's chest with a heavy, definitive thud. "Those are your termination papers, Preston," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "Effective immediately. The FBI has the originals." Preston flinched violently as the heavy packet hit him. He slowly raised his head, his bloodshot, terrified eyes focusing on the top page. He saw the Aegis capital letterhead immediately. But more importantly, his eyes locked onto the embossed seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation attached to the subpoena order, sitting just underneath his termination notice. He fell back into his chair, gasping for air, as if he had just been submerged in freezing water. His hands shook so violently that he could barely hold the edges of the paper. The manic hope he had harbored just minutes ago, the delusion that he could somehow call a defense lawyer and destroy the digital evidence, was completely obliterated in an instant. "They have the hard drives." Preston wheezed, his face turning an alarming shade of gray as he read the list of seized evidence. "How did they get the physical hard drives?" "I paid the security chief a fortune to wipe them clean." "The security chief works for whoever signs his paycheck," I replied smoothly. "And as of this morning, Aegis Capital signs his paycheck. He was more than happy to hand over your encrypted drives to secure his own severance package. You surrounded yourself with greedy mercenaries, Preston. You should not be surprised when they sell you out." Preston dropped the papers onto his lap. He looked up at me, the arrogant corporate executive entirely gone. He clasped his hands together in a pathetic gesture of begging. "Nora, please," he cried, tears spilling from his eyes. "You have the power to stop this. You are the CEO. Tell them it was an accounting error. I will pay back every single cent. I cannot go to federal prison. Just call them off. I stared at the man who had mocked my supposed freelance career to elevate his own fragile ego. "I do not negotiate with thieves, Preston," I said softly. "And I certainly do not hire them. Enjoy the service exit." Savannah stood near the coat rack, realizing her golden future was nothing but a mirage. There was no mansion, only a federal indictment. My mother grabbed her cashmere coat, her aristocratic pride utterly broken. My father stared blankly at the wall, completely ruined. "Ms. Hastings," Carter said respectfully, "my car is waiting out front." "Thank you, Carter," I replied. I looked at Jasmine. "Ready to go." "More than ready," Jasmine smiled. "Let us get out of here." Jasmine and I turned toward the heavy oak doors, completely ready to leave the suffocating atmosphere of the VIP room forever. But before we could even cross the threshold, the sound of tearing fabric and a desperate high-pitched wail pulled our attention back to the center of the room. Savannah had thrown herself onto Preston. She was grabbing the lapels of his ruined suit, violently shaking him back and forth. Her expensive silk dress, a designer piece she had bragged about endlessly during the appetizers, was now crumpled and stained with spilled wine. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess around her face. "Preston, look at me," Savannah screamed, her voice completely hoarse and frantic. "Tell them it is a prank. Tell them you hired this guy with the briefcase to scare my parents. You are a senior vice president. You have stock options. You love me. Tell them you love me and we are going to buy that house in the Gold Coast." Preston looked down at the federal subpoena resting in his lap. The official red seal was a physical weight crushing his chest, a finalized ticket to a federal penitentiary. He slowly looked up at Savannah, and the last remaining shred of his charming, perfect boyfriend persona dissolved into pure venomous hatred. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and feral. He violently shoved her backward with so much force that she stumbled, her hip colliding hard against the edge of the mahogany table. "Get off of me, you pathetic idiot!" "Preston!" roared his voice, echoing sharply off the wood-paneled walls. My mother gasped, taking a step forward to intervene, but the sheer rage radiating from Preston froze her in her tracks. "This is your fault!" Preston spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at Savannah's tear-streaked face. "You did this to me! You sat there for 6 months drinking my expensive wine, spending my money, and telling me your older sister was a broke freelance typist who lived off your father's charity. You told me she was an absolute nobody. If you had just told me the truth, if you actually knew a single thing about your own family, I would have known Aegis Capital was watching me. I would have covered my tracks. I would have moved the money to a different offshore proxy." Savannah clutched her side where she had hit the table, looking at him as if he had just turned into a monster right in front of her. "I did not know," she sobbed, holding her hands up in a desperate defensive gesture. "She hid it from us. But it does not matter, Preston. We can fight this together. I am going to be your wife. We are partners." Preston let out a harsh, barking laugh that sounded completely unhinged. It was the sound of a man whose sanity had snapped under the pressure of his own arrogance. "My wife," Preston mocked, his upper lip curling into a sneer of absolute disgust. "Are you actually that stupid? I never wanted to marry you, Savannah. I do not even like you. You are the most shallow, irritating, incredibly vain woman I have ever met in my entire life." My father tried to step forward to defend his golden child, finding a brief spark of his old temper. "Do not speak to my daughter that way," Richard barked. "Carter." My attorney immediately stepped directly into Richard's path, his cold, unwavering stare forcing my father to halt instantly. Preston ignored Richard entirely, keeping his furious gaze locked on Savannah. "I only dated you because your father is a loud-mouthed idiot who cannot stop bragging after 2 glasses of scotch," Preston confessed, his words delivering the final fatal blow to Savannah's reality. He talked endlessly at the country club about his offshore logistics accounts and his private shipping warehouses. I needed a failing, desperate company to wash my embezzled money through before the Aegis acquisition finalized. You were an easy mark. You were just a shiny, expensive distraction while I planned my exit strategy. Savannah stopped crying. The shock of his words hit her system like a physical tranquilizer, completely paralyzing her. You were so desperate for a diamond ring and a country club membership that you never once asked to see my actual financial statements. Preston continued mercilessly. I was going to use your father's rotting business to clean my $1.4 million, and then I was going to dump you the second the wire transfers cleared the banks in the Cayman Islands. You mean absolutely nothing to me. Savannah's knees buckled. The absolute undeniable reality of her situation finally crushed her. She was not a prize. She was not a beloved fiancée destined for high society. She was a gullible pawn in a federal crime discarded the exact second she was no longer useful to a con artist. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest, and began to wail. It was not a performative cry for attention, like she had used her entire life to manipulate our parents. It was the deep, agonizing sound of a woman whose entire identity, ego, and future had just been violently ripped away. She buried her face in her arms, completely shattered. Savannah's agonizing cries filled the ruined VIP room, but my father barely looked at her. He stepped over his golden child as if she were nothing more than a discarded coat on the hardwood floor. His mind utterly incapable of accepting total defeat at the hands of the daughter he had always despised, was desperately searching for a new narrative. He needed a loophole. He needed a way to rationalize the absolute humiliating destruction of his massive ego. He stopped a few feet away from me, his breathing ragged and shallow. His eyes darted to Carter, my impeccably dressed attorney, and then back to me. A sudden delusional spark of defiance lit up his bloodshot eyes. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. "This is a front," Richard spat, his voice regaining a pathetic fraction of its former booming volume. "You are a puppet." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely fascinated by the sheer depths of his denial. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "You did not build a multi-million-dollar private equity firm from scratch." My father sneered, his deep-seated misogyny bleeding through every single word. "You do not have the brains or the ruthless instinct for corporate rating. You are just a face. You are a diversity hire to make some hidden board of directors look progressive. Who is really pulling the strings here, Nora? Who gave you the capital? Who is your boss? Tell me who is actually in charge of Aegis, so I can talk to him man to man and fix this ridiculous mess." My mother Diane immediately clung to this new delusion like a drowning victim grasping at driftwood. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes wide with frantic, pathetic hope. "That makes perfect sense. Nora, just introduce your father to your boss. He can negotiate a settlement. He speaks their language. We can handle all of this quietly and keep it out of the papers." I looked at the two of them standing in the ruins of their own making, still desperately clinging to the belief that a man had to be in charge to wield this kind of power. I slowly reached up and adjusted the lapels of my tailored charcoal blazer. I stood perfectly straight, letting the full, undeniable weight of my authority settle over the silent room. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was looking directly into my father's panicked eyes. "I do not have a boss, Dad," I said, my voice resonating with absolute, unbreakable power. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain eye contact, but he was already failing. His jaw trembled slightly. "There is no shadow board of directors." I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. "There is no male investor pulling my strings. I own 100% of the voting shares of Aegis Capital. I built the proprietary trading algorithms myself. I secured the initial venture funding under a blind trust. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer. I bought Nova Data this morning with cash, and I just fired your golden boy." My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The absolute certainty in my voice completely dismantled his last remaining defense mechanism. "You spent my entire life telling me I was too soft, too stupid, and too pathetic to survive in the real business world," I said, leaning in slightly to ensure he heard every syllable. "You told Savannah she was the brilliant one because she knew how to manipulate men with money. But while you were busy grooming her to be a useless trophy wife, I was quietly building an empire. I am the apex predator you always pretended to be, Dad, and I just swallowed your entire legacy whole." Richard physically recoiled, stumbling backward, until the back of his knees hit the edge of a heavy dining chair. He collapsed into the seat, landing heavily right next to Preston. The two arrogant, deceitful men who had started the evening boasting about their wealth and their elite corporate power were now sitting side by side, completely stripped of their dignity, their finances, and their futures. Diane let out a quiet, defeated whimper. She covered her face with her manicured hands, finally realizing that there was no man to negotiate with, no charm she could use, and no social status that could save her. The daughter she had treated like garbage was the undisputed architect of their complete ruin. Carter closed his leather briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. "The paperwork is finalized, Ms. Hastings," he said professionally, completely ignoring the shattered family surrounding us. "The authorities are ready at the service exit to take Preston into federal custody. The local police have also arrived to ensure the rest of your party vacates the premises immediately." "Perfect," I replied. I looked down at Preston, who was staring blankly at the floor, and my father, who was staring at his own trembling hands. I turned to my sister-in-law. "Let us go, Jasmine. We have a company to run tomorrow." Jasmine and I took our first steps toward the doorway. The finality of the moment should have been the end of it, but my mother's reality distortion field was incredibly stubborn. She physically lunged forward again, her heels scraping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. "Wait!" Diane shrieked, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "You are not walking out of here like you own the place." I stopped and turned my head just enough to look at her over my shoulder. "I do own the place, Mom. Literally." Diane shook her head with such violent denial that a pearl hairpin came loose, letting a strand of her blonde hair fall across her terrified face. "It is impossible," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Carter and then at me. "You hired actors. You forged these documents. You are a freelance typist. You do not have the money to pull off something like this. You are just trying to embarrass us in front of polite society." The general manager, who had been waiting just outside the heavy oak doors with his two burly security guards, stepped fully back into the VIP room. He had clearly heard enough of my mother's hysterical, baseless delusions. He adjusted his perfectly tailored suit jacket and cleared his throat, commanding the room with his practiced hospitality authority. "Excuse me, madam," the manager said smoothly, his eyes fixed on my mother. Diane immediately turned her desperate attention to him. "Yes, tell her," Diane demanded, her tone instantly reverting to the haughty, demanding country club customer she always played. "Tell this ridiculous girl to stop making a scene. Throw her out. She is causing a disturbance and ruining Savannah's evening." The manager looked at my mother with an expression of polite, absolute pity. The kind of look you give a stray animal that does not realize it is standing in traffic. "I cannot do that, Mrs. Diane," he replied, his voice carrying a calm, devastating truth. "Ms. Nora is not just our most valued corporate client, Aegis Capital. Ms. Nora's firm owns this entire commercial real estate block. She is our landlord. The restaurant group answers directly to her holding company." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. It was one thing for me to declare my wealth, but hearing it confirmed by the impeccably dressed manager of one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago finally shattered the illusion completely. A neutral, highly respected third party had just validated everything I said. The crushing weight of my massive wealth and power physically hit my parents. Diane stumbled backward as if the manager had struck her across the face. She bumped into the edge of the dining table, her hands gripping the ruined tablecloth to keep herself from collapsing onto the hardwood floor next to Savannah. Her mind was rapidly calculating the devastating social fallout. Without the trust fund, without the logistics company, and without Preston's fabricated millions, they would be exiled from their elite circles. Their friends would abandon them. The high society life she had violently protected was completely over. My father, Richard, who had been staring blankly at the floor, slowly raised his head. His eyes locked onto me, but the arrogance, the disdain, and the patriarchal superiority were completely eradicated. In their place was raw, unadulterated awe, mixed with a sickening level of fear. He realized that the red foreclosure folder on the table was not a bluff. He had built his entire identity around being the intimidating boss who demanded respect. Now he was just a man drowning in debt standing in a building owned by the daughter he had gleefully abused. The dynamic of the room completely flipped in a matter of seconds. For 34 years they had held all the power. They controlled the purse strings, the family narratives, and the social standing. They used their money as a weapon to demand my obedience and punish my independence. Now they realized they were absolutely destitute, and the daughter they had treated like a diseased stray held the keys to their entire existence. "Nora?" My mother whispered, the venom in her voice entirely replaced by a pathetic trembling reverence. "You really own all of this. You are a billionaire." I did not answer her. I did not need to. The silence was an agonizing confirmation of their worst nightmare. They had spent decades actively alienating the most powerful person they would ever meet. My father suddenly stood up, his massive frame hunched over in a posture of complete subservience. "Nora, please listen to me," he begged, taking a slow, cautious step toward me, as if approaching a wild predator. "The logistics company is my life. It is the family legacy. You cannot just dissolve it. You have the power to restructure the debt. You could make me a silent partner. You could keep the family name alive. We can work together. I can be your advisor." I looked at the man who had threatened to change the locks on my apartment just an hour ago. "You have nothing left to advise me on, Dad," I said coldly. "You are a failed businessman who resorted to stealing from his own children." Brandon, still kneeling on the floor near Jasmine's discarded wedding ring, looked up with tear-filled eyes. "Nora, you are our sister," he pleaded weakly. "You cannot just leave us with nothing. What are we supposed to do?" "You are going to do exactly what you told me to do earlier tonight, Brandon," I replied, my voice hard and unforgiving. "You are going to go find another table, because this one does not belong to you anymore." Brandon shrank back as if he had been physically struck, his tears instantly drying up in the face of my absolute zero empathy. He looked at Jasmine, but she had already turned her back to him. The message was clear. We were done playing family. But my father Richard possessed a level of narcissistic delusion that bordered on pathological. The absolute rejection I had just handed his son did not register as a warning. Instead, his twisted mind processed my ruthlessness as a corporate asset. He watched me dismantle Brandon, and a sickening, genuine smile suddenly split across his face. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand, and visibly straightened his posture, puffing his chest out to regain his commanding physical presence. "Nora," he bellowed, his voice suddenly taking on the booming, jovial tone he usually reserved for his wealthy country club buddies. "My brilliant girl." I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the sheer elasticity of his ego. He took another step toward me, throwing his arms wide open as if preparing to wrap me in a warm, paternal embrace. "I see exactly what you are doing." Richard laughed loudly, shaking his head as if we were sharing a private, highly intellectual joke. "You are testing me. You are showing me that you have the killer instinct. I have to admit, I completely underestimated you tonight. But I get it now. You built Aegis Capital by being absolutely ruthless. That is exactly the kind of blood that runs in my veins. You are my daughter through and through." He was standing in a room he was currently being legally evicted from, holding the federal foreclosure papers to his own business, and he was trying to claim genetic credit for my success. "If you own Aegis," my father continued, his eyes gleaming with manic, desperate greed, "then you have the capital to save my logistics company. We are facing total bankruptcy by the end of next month. The creditors are circling. But a firm of your size could wipe out my operating debt with a single signature. You can bail out your own family, Nora." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, as if pitching a lucrative startup. "We can restructure the board of directors. I will step down as CEO and become the chairman to save face. You can inject $5 million into our accounts tomorrow morning to cover payroll and the union contracts. With your capital and my industry connections, we will absolutely dominate the Midwest shipping lanes. We will be unstoppable." He clapped his heavy hands together, his smile wide and terrifyingly sincere. He was acting as if the last 34 years of relentless emotional abuse had simply evaporated into thin air. He was acting as if less than an hour ago he had not screamed in my face, threatened to change the locks on my apartment, and demanded I apologize to a criminal. My mother, ever the opportunistic parasite, immediately caught on to his survival strategy. She wiped the smeared mascara from under her eyes, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk dress. She stepped up beside my father, pasting a brittle, sickeningly sweet smile onto her face. "Your father is absolutely right, Nora," Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We always knew you were destined for greatness. Why do you think we were so hard on you growing up? We knew you had this incredible untapped potential. We pushed you because we wanted you to be strong enough to survive in the corporate world. And look at you now. You are a billionaire. All of our tough love finally paid off." The sheer audacity of their historical revisionism was breathtaking. They were standing over the shattered remnants of my sister's life and my brother's marriage, completely ignoring Savannah weeping on the floor and Preston hyperventilating in his chair. They were trying to rewrite decades of cruelty into a heartwarming tale of tough love and parental guidance. I did not break eye contact with my father. I let him stand there with his arms wide open, his desperate, greedy smile slowly starting to tremble at the corners, when I did not immediately return his enthusiasm. "You want a $5 million capital injection?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Richard nodded eagerly, his eyes lighting up. "Just to cover the immediate payroll and vendor deficits. Once we stabilize the accounts, we can talk about a long-term expansion strategy. You know the logistics business, Nora. You know it is a goldmine with the right financial backing. It is a toxic asset, Dad." I corrected him, my tone sharpening into a lethal blade. "Your fleet of delivery trucks is obsolete. Your warehouse leases are drastically overpriced because you refuse to negotiate in good faith. You alienated your best distribution partners because of your massive, fragile ego. And you embezzled from your own daughter's trust fund to cover your gross incompetence. You do not have a business. You have a massive liability." Richard's smile finally cracked. The terrifying reality of his situation crashed back down on him. His arms slowly dropped to his sides, the fake joviality melting away into pure, pathetic desperation. "Nora, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I am your father. You owe me. I put a roof over your head. I gave you everything." I stared at him for a long moment. The sheer audacity of his claim hung in the air, pathetic and hollow. He gave me everything. He put a roof over my head. He was still trying to play the patriarch card, even as his entire empire burned to the ground right in front of him. I let out a laugh. It was not a chuckle or a polite sound of amusement. It was a cold, hard laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls of the VIP room, sending a visible shiver down my mother's spine. "Bail you out?" I asked, the remnants of my laughter fading into a lethal, icy stare. I turned back to the marble credenza where Carter was packing up his briefcase. I signaled him with a slight nod. Carter snapped the briefcase back open, reached into the bottom compartment, and handed me a second, thicker folder. This one was bound in heavy black leather. I walked back to my father and dropped the black folder right onto his chest. He fumbled to catch it, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it onto the floor. "Dad, who do you think bought your debt from Wells Fargo 3 months ago?" I asked, my voice slicing through his remaining delusions. He stared at the black folder, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Wells Fargo sent a letter," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an escape route. "They said my loans were sold to a private syndicate, a silent partner group. They said as long as I made the minimum interest payments, they would not call in the principal balance. Aegis Capital is the syndicate," I replied, stepping closer so he had to look up at me. "We are your primary creditor. You missed the minimum interest payment last week because you used the remaining company funds to pay for Savannah's country club wedding deposit." You breached the final covenant of your loan. And as of 5 p.m. today, we are foreclosing on all your assets due to default. Richard shook his head violently, clutching the folder as if he could crush the legal reality inside it. You cannot take the business, Nora. I am shielded. The logistics company is a limited liability corporation. It is a separate legal entity. If the business goes under, the bank takes the trucks and the warehouses. They cannot touch my personal money. They cannot touch me. I have corporate protection. I looked at him with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. You really are a terrible businessman, Dad. Did you even read the refinancing paperwork you signed 18 months ago when you were desperate for cash to keep up appearances? The blood drained completely from his face. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on an active landmine. You were bleeding capital? I explained my words slow and deliberate so every syllable landed perfectly. No reputable bank was going to extend your commercial credit line without collateral. In order to get the cash to keep your doors open, you signed a personal guarantee. You waived your corporate liability shield. You tied your personal estate directly to the commercial debt. Diane let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Richard, what does she mean? Diane demanded, her voice rising to a hysterical, grating pitch. What personal guarantee? What did you sign behind my back? My father could not answer her. He just stared at the black folder in his hands, his mouth opening and closing silently. His broad shoulders caved inward. The man who used to scream at waitstaff and belittle his own children was shrinking before my eyes. It means, Mom, I said, turning my attention to her horrified face, that Aegis Capital does not just own the logistics company. We own everything tied to his name. The foreclosure includes the corporate headquarters, the delivery fleet, and the commercial leases. But because of the personal guarantee, it also includes your primary residence. It includes the summer house. It includes the investment portfolios you have not already drained. Diane stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She looked down at her expensive jewelry, the pearl necklace she wore like a badge of honor, suddenly realizing it might be the only thing she owned, free and clear. No, she wailed, shaking her head. Our house, our home. You cannot take our home, Nora. Where are we supposed to go? What about my social circle? Savannah, who had been weeping silently on the floor, suddenly looked up. Her tear-streaked face was a picture of absolute devastation. The house, Savannah choked out. You lost the house too, Dad. You lost everything. I lost it to her. Richard suddenly screamed, his fear momentarily giving way to a desperate, unhinged fury. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She set me up. She bought the debt just to ruin me. She has been planning this for years out of pure spite. I did not set you up, Dad, I replied, my voice perfectly level. You ruined your business all by yourself through sheer incompetence and arrogance. You took out loans you could never repay to fund a lifestyle you could no longer afford. I simply purchased the paper. If it had not been Aegis Capital, it would have been another private equity firm stripping you down to the studs by next week. The only difference is that another firm might have let you declare bankruptcy and walk away with a fraction of your dignity. I am taking it all. You owe me, Richard repeated, his voice breaking into a pathetic, hollow sob. I am your blood. You made it very clear my entire life that blood meant nothing, unless it came with a paycheck, I said coldly. You worshipped money. You worshipped status. You judged my entire existence based on my supposed lack of financial success. Well, you got exactly what you wanted. I became a spectacular financial success, and my first order of business is liquidating yours. My mother stared at me, her chest heaving as the finality of my words echoed in the ruined dining room. The sheer magnitude of the financial destruction was too massive for her fragile, status-obsessed mind to process all at once. Her pristine world of country club luncheons, charity galas, and quiet superiority was disintegrating into ash. But Diane was a creature of vicious survival. When cornered, she always looked for the nearest weapon to inflict pain. She violently shook off her shock, her face contorting into an ugly, desperate snarl. She took a step forward, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "You think you have won?" Diane shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated malice. "You think you can just march in here and strip us of everything we own? You are forgetting one very important detail, you ungrateful little brat. The condo." My father groaned, dropping his head into his hands, already knowing where this was going based on our earlier exchange, but Diane was far too hysterical to notice his complete surrender. Richard might have signed away the logistics company, and the house, my mother raged on, her eyes wild with a manic delusional triumph. "But your apartment was purchased through a joint family account. My name is on that original deed alongside your father's. And if we are going down, we are liquidating that property immediately. We are evicting you tonight, Nora. I will call the police myself to have you physically dragged out of that building. We will sell it for cash tomorrow morning and use the money to hire a ruthless legal team to tie your little company up in court for the next decade." She was panting by the time she finished her threat, a terrifying smile stretching across her face. She truly believed she had found the one remaining thread of power she held over my life. She believed she could render me homeless with a single phone call. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of fear or concern. I simply turned back to the stack of documents Carter had neatly arranged on the marble credenza before he stepped out. I pulled a single thick sheet of heavy parchment paper from the bottom of the pile. It bore the raised gold embossed seal of the Cook County Recorder's Office. I walked slowly back to the table and slid the property deed across the stained white tablecloth. It glided smoothly, coming to a dead stop right in front of Diane's trembling hands. "I bought the building 2 years ago through a shell LLC. I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Diane stared down at the document. Her eyes scanned the bold black ink, landing on the name Horizon Properties, LLC, and right below it, my unmistakable signature listed as the sole managing director and primary title holder. "You have been paying maintenance fees to me this whole time." I continued, watching the manic triumph completely drain from her face. "You own nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. Diane picked up the deed with both hands, bringing it closer to her face, as if the words might magically rearrange themselves into a reality she could accept. "When Dad missed 4 consecutive mortgage payments 26 months ago, the bank initiated the foreclosure process," I explained coldly. "I stepped in and bought the debt. I bought the entire building. The letters you received in the mail about your mortgage being transferred to a new management company, that was Aegis Capital. The monthly checks you proudly wrote to Horizon Properties, the ones you constantly complained about while telling me you were keeping a roof over my head, out of the goodness of your heart, those checks went directly into my personal accounts." "No," Diane whispered, the paper shaking violently in her grip. "No, Richard said he fixed it. He said he refinanced. He lied to you, Mom," I said relentlessly. "He lied to you to cover up his own spectacular failures, just like he lied to his creditors. You spent the last 2 years holding that apartment over my head. You threatened to kick me out every time I did not comply with your ridiculous demands. You used it to force me to come to this dinner tonight so Savannah could have an audience to mock. You used that condo as your ultimate weapon against me. But you were holding an unloaded gun. You do not own the property. You are just my very delinquent tenants." The last pillar of Diane's identity shattered. The realization that she had been unknowingly funding my empire while believing she was my savior completely destroyed her. Her legs gave out. She collapsed backward into her heavy wooden dining chair. The document fluttered from her hands, landing face up on the floor. She brought her hands to her face and began sobbing. It was not a delicate performative cry. It was an ugly, uncontrollable weeping that shook her entire body. She rocked back and forth in the chair, mourning the absolute death of her wealth, her status, and her power. She had absolutely nothing left to her name, and she knew it. Diane's loud, rhythmic sobbing was the only sound in the ruined VIP room. Richard was completely paralyzed, staring at the property deed on the floor as if it were a physical manifestation of his own grave. Preston remained slumped in his chair, broken and awaiting federal custody. Savannah was curled into a ball on the hardwood, weeping over the loss of a life that was never real to begin with. The sheer magnitude of the destruction had finally silenced the loudest, most arrogant people I had ever known. But the silence was suddenly broken by the scraping of a chair. Brandon, my older brother, who had spent the entire evening trying to make himself invisible to avoid the crossfire, slowly stood up. He had always been the ultimate coward. He never actively participated in the worst of the abuse, but he never stopped it either. He simply rode our parents' coattails, accepting the comfortable salary at my father's logistics company and keeping his head down. Now that his comfortable life was officially being liquidated, he suddenly found his voice. He walked around the edge of the large mahogany table, carefully stepping over the spilled wine. He stopped a few feet away from me, wringing his hands together nervously. "Nora, please," Brandon pleaded, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate whine. "You have made your point. You won. You proved to everyone that you are smarter and more successful than all of us combined. But you have to stop this now. You cannot just destroy everything." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. "I cannot destroy it, Brandon," I replied. "It is already destroyed. I am simply the one holding the paperwork." "But you can fix it," he argued, taking a desperate step closer. "You can forgive the debt. You can give Dad his company back. You can let Mom keep the condo. We are your family, Nora. We share the same blood. You cannot just throw your own blood out onto the street. Think about what this is going to do to us. Think about me and Jasmine. I work for Dad. If you dissolve the logistics company, I lose my job. We have a mortgage to pay. We want to start a family soon. You are punishing me for things Mom and Dad did." I stared at him, marveling at his absolute lack of self-awareness. "I am not punishing you, Brandon," I said, my voice hard and unforgiving. "I am firing you. Because you are an overpaid, incompetent regional manager in a bankrupt company, and do not dare stand there and pretend you are an innocent bystander. You sat at this very table tonight and told Jasmine to apologize to Preston after he insulted me. You watched them tear me down my entire life, and you never said a single word in my defense because you were too terrified of losing your allowance. You chose your side a long time ago." Brandon opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the air, sharp and filled with absolute disgust. "Stop talking, Brandon." Everyone turned to look at Jasmine. She had been standing quietly near the back of the room, watching the entire spectacle unfold. Throughout the years, she had been subjected to my parents' microaggressions, their thinly veiled racist remarks, and their constant disrespect. And through it all, Brandon had always told her to just ignore it, to keep the peace, to not make a scene. Jasmine walked slowly toward her husband. Her posture was perfectly straight, her dark eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising clarity. She looked at the man she had married, really looked at him, and saw exactly what I had always seen. A weak, spineless pawn who would always sacrifice his own wife to appease his toxic parents. "You are actually begging her," Jasmine said, her tone dripping with profound disappointment. "Your father gambled away your sister's trust fund. Your mother treated her like garbage. This man over here," she pointed at Preston, "tried to use your family for federal money laundering. And your response is to beg Nora to save them. You want her to hand over millions of dollars to the people who abused her, just so you do not have to go out and find a real job." Brandon reached out, trying to grab her hands. "Jazz, please, you do not understand. I am trying to save our life." "You are trying to save your comfort," Jasmine corrected him, pulling her hands away as if his touch burned. "I spent years waiting for you to stand up to them. I spent years waiting for you to defend me when your mother made comments about my hair or my background. But you never did. And seeing you right now groveling to the sister you never once protected just to save the parents who ruined her. It is pathetic." "Jazz, we are married," Brandon cried, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. "We are supposed to be a team." Jasmine looked at him, the last ounce of love draining completely from her face. We were never a team, Brandon. You were always on their team. She reached for her left hand. She grasped the beautiful, expensive diamond ring Brandon had given her. With one smooth, deliberate motion, Jasmine slid the ring off her finger. Brandon let out a strangled gasp, his hands reaching out defensively. Jasmine, no, do not do this. Jasmine stepped forward and placed the heavy gold ring firmly onto the polished mahogany table right next to the property deed that had just ruined my mother. The metallic clink sounded like a judge's gavel, finalizing a sentence. I am done, Jasmine announced, her voice, echoing with absolute freedom. I am done shrinking myself to fit into this miserable family, and I am done being anchored to a coward. You can stay here and sink with them, Brandon. I am leaving. She turned her back on him, completely ignoring his frantic sobbing, and walked over to stand right beside me. Jasmine stood shoulder to shoulder with me, her presence a solid wall of solidarity against the crumbling ruins of my family. Brandon remained frozen on his knees, staring at the empty space where his wife had just stood. He reached out with a trembling hand, his tear-streaked face a picture of utter bewilderment. Jasmine, you cannot be serious. Brandon choked out, his voice barely a whisper. We have a life together. You cannot just throw it all away because you are mad at my parents. Jasmine looked down at him, her expression completely devoid of the warmth and patience she had given him for years. I am not throwing our life away, Brandon, she said, her voice steady and carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken grievances. I am throwing away the anchor that has been drowning me since the day we got married. I am done being treated like garbage by this family. I am done being the target of their passive-aggressive remarks, their blatant disrespect, and their suffocating entitlement. But most importantly, I am done watching you do absolutely nothing about it. Brandon flinched as if she had struck him. He looked toward our parents, instinctively seeking their intervention, their protection. But Richard was entirely consumed by the black folder spelling his financial doom, and Diane was still rocking back and forth in her chair, mourning her lost luxury condo. Neither of them even registered Brandon's collapsing marriage. Look at them, Jasmine instructed, pointing a firm finger at Richard and Diane. Look at the people you sacrificed our marriage to protect. They do not care about you, Brandon. They only care about what you can do for them. And now that they have nothing, they will drag you down with them. I refuse to be a casualty of their toxic sinking ship. I watched Jasmine, feeling a profound surge of respect. For years I had watched her bite her tongue, swallow her pride, and try to make peace with a family that fundamentally viewed her as an outsider. Now she was finally reclaiming her power. I turned to face her, a genuine warm smile breaking through the cold facade I had maintained all evening. You know, Jasmine, I said, making sure my voice was loud enough for my parents and brother to hear every single word. Aegis Capital has been expanding aggressively over the last quarter. We recently acquired several massive portfolios, including a certain logistics company that is currently in desperate need of a complete structural overhaul. Jasmine met my gaze, a spark of realization and intrigue lighting up her dark eyes. Is that so? She asked smoothly. It is, I confirmed, nodding slowly. In fact, I have been actively headhunting for a new vice president of operations. I need someone who is fiercely intelligent, highly organized, and absolutely unwilling to tolerate incompetence or toxic behavior from anyone. Someone with an iron will and a flawless moral compass. Brandon let out a strangled gasp, his eyes widening in horror as he realized exactly what I was doing. Nora, no, he pleaded, scrambling to his feet. You cannot do this. You cannot give her a job at your company. That is my wife. You are tearing my family apart. I ignored him completely, keeping my focus entirely on the brilliant woman standing beside me. The salary starts at $400,000 a year, I said, clearly articulating the numbers so it would echo in the silent room. It also includes a comprehensive executive benefits package, full stock options, and complete autonomy over the restructuring division. Are you interested, Jasmine? Jasmine did not hesitate. She did not look back at Brandon. She did not look at the sobbing ruins of Savannah or the catatonic state of my parents. She smiled back at me, a radiant, triumphant expression that completely transformed her face. Absolutely, Jasmine replied, her voice ringing with newfound freedom and undeniable confidence. I accept. When do I start? Tomorrow morning at 8, I said, reaching out to shake her hand. Welcome to Aegis Capital. The sound of our hands clasping together was the final nail in the coffin. Diane let out a loud, agonizing wail. She finally registered what had just happened. Her own daughter, the billionaire she was just begging for salvation, had just handed a massive fortune and an elite corporate position to the very daughter-in-law she had spent years looking down upon. You vindictive little monster, Diane shrieked, her voice cracking with pure unadulterated jealousy. You give that kind of money to an outsider while your own flesh and blood loses everything. You are giving our legacy to her. She is not an outsider, Mom, I replied, my voice turning to ice. Jasmine is the only person in this entire room who actually knows the meaning of loyalty and respect. She earned her place at my table. You lost yours. Brandon fell back to his knees, burying his face in his hands, completely shattered. He had lost his job, his future, and the only woman who had ever truly loved him, all in the span of an hour. Jasmine looked at him one last time, a brief flash of pity crossing her features, before she turned away completely. Jasmine adjusted the strap of her elegant handbag, her shoulders relaxed, and her head held high. She looked at the expensive diamond ring sitting abandoned on the mahogany table right next to the property deed that had sealed my parents' fate. That ring used to represent a promise, she said quietly, more to herself than to the broken man sobbing on the floor. But all it ever did was weigh me down. I picked up my coat from the back of my chair. Let us go, Jasmine, I said, turning my back on the wreckage. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow, and I want to introduce you to the executive board. While my mother was busy screaming at me about giving her precious legacy to an outsider, a sudden commotion near the back of the room caught my attention. Preston, realizing that my family was entirely distracted by their own financial and marital implosions, had seen his one desperate opportunity. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive leather shoes slipping briefly on the spilled wine, and shoved past one of the security guards, who was momentarily looking at my screaming mother. Before anyone could grab his arm, Preston bolted through the heavy service doors leading to the restaurant kitchen. He was making a pathetic, panicked run for the alleyway, completely abandoning Savannah to face the wreckage alone. He would not get far. Carter had already confirmed the federal agents were waiting at every possible exit, but the sheer cowardice of his flight was the perfect punctuation to his entire character. Savannah saw the wooden doors swing shut behind him. She let out a sound that barely sounded human, a guttural, tearing screech of total abandonment. Preston, she wailed, crawling toward the service doors in her ruined designer dress. He left me. He actually left me. She collapsed onto the floor, her hands slamming against the hardwood, weeping over a criminal who had literally sprinted away to avoid federal prison, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a shattered ego and a cancelled wedding. My father was in no condition to comfort his golden child. Richard had slumped forward, his heavy elbows resting on the table, both hands clutching the fabric over his chest. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, ragged, terrifying gasps. For a split second I thought he might actually be having a heart attack, but as I watched his eyes dart wildly around the room, taking in the federal foreclosure documents, the property deed to my condo, and the absolute destruction of his empire, I realized it was just a severe panic attack. The massive, intimidating patriarch, who had controlled everyone through financial fear, was suffocating under the weight of his own complete ruin. He had lost his company. He had lost his home. He had lost his entire legacy. He was utterly broken. Brandon was still on the floor near the edge of the table, weeping over Jasmine's discarded wedding ring, completely paralyzed by his own cowardice. He did not go to help his hyperventilating father. He did not go to comfort his hysterical sister. He just sat there drowning in the realization that his comfortable, subsidized life was over, and the brilliant woman he loved had finally realized his true lack of worth. With her husband gasping for air, her golden child sobbing on the floor, and her son completely broken, Diane finally ran out of threats. The vicious, entitled country club matriarch completely vanished. The reality of her impending poverty crashed down on her, stripping away every ounce of her manufactured dignity. She rushed toward me, her hands reaching out in a frantic, desperate plea. She grabbed the sleeve of my coat, her grip surprisingly strong and trembling violently. "Nora, please," Diane begged, her voice a pathetic, wavering whine that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "I am begging you. Look at your father. Look at what is happening to us. You cannot leave us like this. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize to you right now. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything I ever said to you. Just please give us the condo back. Give your father his business. We will be a real family. I promise we will be different. We will treat you with the exact respect you deserve." I looked down at the woman who had spent 34 years making sure I felt entirely worthless. I looked at the hands clinging to my coat, the same hands that had pointed at the exorbitant restaurant bill earlier and demanded I pay it just to prove my worth. Her apology was not born out of genuine regret for how she had treated me. It was born entirely out of absolute terror for her own survival. She was not sorry she abused me. She was just terrified that her victim was now her landlord. I calmly reached down and peeled her fingers off my sleeve one by one. I smoothed out the fabric of my coat, ensuring my appearance remained as flawless as my resolve. I picked up my leather purse and looked directly into her tear-filled, desperate eyes. "You told me not to embarrass you tonight, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. "Do not worry. I will not be seen with you ever again." Diane let out a choked sob, taking a stumbling step backward, as if the words had physically struck her. She covered her face with her hands, finally understanding that there was absolutely no coming back from this. The bridge was not just burned, it had been completely eradicated. I turned to Jasmine, who was standing tall and ready, her expression radiating absolute strength. "Are you ready to leave?" I asked her. "More than ready," Jasmine replied, offering a small, triumphant smile. We turned our backs on the screaming, crying, and hyperventilating remains of a family that had destroyed themselves with their own greed and arrogance. We walked out of the VIP room together, the heavy oak doors closing firmly behind us, sealing them inside their own perfectly crafted nightmare. That was exactly 365 days ago. 1 full year has passed since that dinner at Alinea, and the fallout was swifter and more absolute than even I had anticipated. Preston did not make it out of the restaurant parking lot. The federal agents apprehended him right next to the valet stand, pinning him against the hood of a rented sports car he could no longer afford. His high-priced corporate lawyers abandoned him the moment Aegis Capital froze his stolen assets. Without the funds to mount a massive defense, he took a plea deal. He is currently serving a 12-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. Savannah, stripped of her trust fund, and her millionaire fiancé had to face the harsh reality she had avoided her entire life. She was forced to sell off her designer handbags and her unworn wedding gown just to hire a bankruptcy lawyer. Last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a mid-tier dental office in the suburbs. She spends her lunch breaks scrolling through social media, watching the high society friends who abandoned her live the life she firmly thought she was entitled to. Her golden child status meant absolutely nothing in the real world. My parents fared no better. The foreclosure on the logistics company was swift and merciless. I dissolved the corporate entity, sold the aging delivery fleet to a competitor, and repurposed the warehouses into highly profitable data centers. Because of the personal guarantee my father so foolishly signed, the bank seized their sprawling suburban home. I followed through on my promise and formally evicted them from my condo building the very next morning. With no assets, no company, and their social standing completely obliterated, Richard and Diane were forced to move into a tiny two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Brandon, having lost his regional manager position when the company folded, moved right in with them. Without Jasmine to anchor him, he regressed entirely. He is now trapped in a miserable, cramped apartment with the two toxic people who ruined his life. They spend their days bickering over grocery bills and blaming each other for their collective downfall. They are stuck with each other, trapped in a prison of their own making. Jasmine, on the other hand, thrived. She stepped into the role of Vice President of Operations at Aegis Capital and completely revolutionized our internal structure. Freed from the suffocating weight of my brother and his toxic family, she blossomed into an absolute corporate powerhouse. She commands respect the moment she walks into a boardroom, and she never has to apologize for her brilliance ever again. She is thriving, happy, and fully recognized for her incredible talent. The cool evening breeze of Chicago swept across the expansive terrace of the Aegis Capital penthouse. I stood near the glass railing looking out over the glittering city skyline. The streets below were rivers of golden light pulsing with life and boundless ambition. I took a slow sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, dry finish. Jasmine stepped out onto the terrace holding her own crystal flute. She wore a stunning emerald green suit that perfectly matched her radiant confidence. "We just closed the European acquisition," she announced, a triumphant smile lighting up her face. "The board unanimously approved your final term sheet." I turned to face my brilliant vice president and my closest friend. I raised my glass. "To cutting the dead weight," I said softly. Jasmine laughed, a rich, joyful sound that carried into the night air. "To building our own empire," she replied, tapping her glass against mine. The gentle clink of crystal echoed perfectly against the backdrop of the city we now owned. Looking back on that disastrous dinner, I realized that the greatest revenge was not the money. It was not seizing their assets or watching them lose their precious social status. The sweetest revenge was taking my power back and walking away without a single ounce of guilt. It was cutting ties with the people who only valued me for what I could tolerate, and building a chosen family with people who valued me for what I could achieve. My parents spent 34 years trying to convince me I was worthless. But standing here at the top of the world, I finally understood that my worth was never something they could dictate. It was something I had to build for myself. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to find your own peace, let me know in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about claiming your power and living life on your own terms. Remember, you do not have to sit at a table where you are not respected. You can always get up and build your own. The story of Nora and her family serves as a powerful testament to the fact that your true worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it. For decades, her parents and siblings tried to shrink her down to fit their own toxic narrative, using money and social status as weapons of control. The most profound lesson we can take from this narrative is that seeking validation from a dysfunctional system is a losing battle. Nora did not waste her precious energy trying to convince her family of her value or begging for a seat at their table. Instead, she quietly redirected that energy and built an entire empire of her own. Her ultimate triumph was not merely the financial checkmate that exposed her abusers, but her absolute emotional detachment. She proved that true power comes from personal independence, unshakable boundaries, and the courage to stop accepting disrespect, masked as family loyalty. Too often, society pressures us to forgive and endure emotional abuse simply because it comes from blood relatives. Nora's journey dismantles that myth entirely. It illustrates that you are allowed to walk away and protect your peace. When you stop pouring your potential into a black hole of familial expectations and start investing it into your own growth, the results can be monumental. The family you are born into does not have to dictate the trajectory of your life. You have the absolute right to choose your own path, cut away the dead weight, and build a chosen family that genuinely respects and uplifts you. If you are currently shrinking yourself to keep the peace in a toxic environment, take your power back today by setting your first unshakable boundary.